Matt, thanks so much for joining. It's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me as a guest. It's good to be here.
Yeah, you have quickly become one of the most interesting people I know that I can claim to know. So, I mean, you catch bad guys for a living and you win awards for it.
Yeah, I've had an interesting career for certain. I like to say that I helped create the security wave and then I wrote it. So,
That, that's so wild. So, if you had to pick out kind of one of your most memorable professional engagements, what would it be?
oh, geez, that's a great question. I think early on, I mean, I could divide it into multiple times throughout my career, but I think early on, when I figured out that I was really onto something, I was running a red team that I had created for the Department of Defense. And we were targeting at the time what were coalition Five Eyes. So Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, and UK military assets during a classified military exercise. And we successfully got onto systems on an aircraft carrier while I was at sea. And that certainly was like an aha moment. I got to be the first person to ever do that. It was just incredible that we were able to accomplish it in the first place. And it also served as this huge wake up call for a whole group of DoD leaders who weren't quite sure what this cybersecurity thing was and what are you talking about? And we can always just shoot your hackers. And we're able to show them, like, no, there are real consequences to operating vulnerable systems and providing access to networks and that sort of stuff. So it was a real kind of pivot point in my career from a technical perspective, but then also from the level of awareness that we were able to raise as a result of that.
And so, what were some of the challenges that came out of that going forward?
The real challenge coming out of it, to be honest, was getting the Department of Defense to actually mitigate the vulnerabilities that we were identifying, right? Because back then there was not a career track for people that were doing systems administration or responsible for cybersecurity. I mean, now you actually have career tracks and positions and promotion chains. Back then that didn't exist. So I remember sitting in rooms with the leadership of Defense Department and basically saying, when I walk out of the room, you need to point your finger at somebody and you need to tell them that they're responsible for fixing this, and then you have to hold them accountable. And of course, none of that happened. So my frustration was that I would walk out of the room, and then 6 months later, this literally was the case. 6 months later, there was a big intrusion into the Department of Defense. I got called in to help with the incident response. And I kid you not, the first system I triaged to look at was one where I had told them to fix it 6 months prior. And guess how the attacker got in? They got in using the vulnerability I told them to fix. So that level of friction or inability to drive real remediation was definitely a challenge associated with that program.
Oh, wow, I can imagine. And then, just pivoting into your entrepreneurial journey, that was that really what you would say the start of your terrorism research center?
It was around the same time frame. The Terrorism Research Center really was a labor of love. I had collaborated on a paper with two colleagues of mine called "Information Terrorism: Can You Trust Your Toaster?" And it got accepted through the peer review process to be published in an academic journal. So it's kind of one of the first official kind of academic papers on the topic. Super exciting. And we wanted to write a follow-up, and we wrote the follow-up, and we didn't want to go the journal route because our frustration with the journal route was that it moves too slow and things move fast. For example, in our original paper, we had wrote this scenario around changing beacons associated with high-risk flight paths for US government planes overseas. And between when we submitted that paper for review and when the paper was published, I think it was the Secretary of Commerce actually died in a plane accident. Now, the beacons hadn't gotten hacked, but it was like a very, very, very similar circumstance. And in fact, the editors allowed us to put a disclaimer before it went to print that said, hey, this scenario was developed way before that incident. So we wanted to move at more rapid speed. We also had this challenge back then. Today we're spoiled. We have 17 ways that you and I can communicate in the next hour if we want to. But back then we didn't. You had email, but that was super slow. It was hard to organize around email. And you didn't have the voice over IP. You had to call people on phones. And that was also expensive because we were dealing with folks internationally. And we said, man, we should create a website, like a secure extranet. Of course, they weren't called extranets back then, but that's what we built. We built a secure website, and we told everybody, hey, come to this platform and we're going to organize our research and organize our community around this. we soon realized that we had something that was worthwhile. And actually, the three of us, the three founders, got together and cooked some elk that somebody had, from a family member. And we filed the articles of incorporation in the state of Virginia. And thus the entity was born. But all three of us had full-time jobs elsewhere. In fact, I had to get permission from the CEO of my company at the time to operate this. And he was 100% supportive of it and said as long as it didn't interfere with my daily job, which it didn't, that it was okay. Then that started to take on a life of its own, right? We started attracting a lot of attention with the research that we were publishing. The site started to be popular. We started getting inbound requests. A Japanese auto firm would reach out and say, can you do a special study for us on this topic? And then I remember Pierce County out in the Seattle area reached out and said, can you do custom training for us? So it started to develop some of its own momentum, and migrated from labor of love to me leaving my position at the time and becoming the full-time CEO of that entity.
Oh, that's incredible. And now you've talked a lot about before how kind of your network and community is so important in cybersecurity. Now, I'm a business development professional, so I understand the importance of a network, but it didn't really resonate with me how it would be as equally, if not more important as a cybersecurity professional. And so I would love for you to talk through kind of how you built that network, that community, and why it's so important.
Sure. I think part of it really is that anytime you're participating in a community, that you're doing it for the right reasons, right? I was curious. I was connecting to learn. I was connecting to share. I was connecting to collaborate. And I think that were kind of the key elements of, my getting involved in the hacker community and in the early stages of the cybersecurity community and building a really robust counterterrorism network. I mean, we at one point had, thousands of first responders tied in to our terrorism research center network. It allowed me to participate in trust and affinity groups because collaboration on these topics becomes super important. These problems are bigger than any one person is going to solve. They're bigger than any one organization is going to solve. So always had a collaboration first model. And people would joke, and even today they say, oh my gosh, like you're collaborating with your competitors. And like as it relates to solving these problems, there are no competitors, right? I mean, markets have competitors,
Mm-hmm.
and I've competed as an entrepreneur against people. But when you're trying to manage these complex problems, you really need to look beyond it, and that's been the foundation. I always put myself in a position to be useful. I always entered into relationships for the right reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Never wanted any sort of quid pro quo. I think that's one of my pet peeves from a relationship perspective is people that come in and they want to like trade favors or trade this or trade that. It's like, no, if I'm going to help you, I'm going to help you. And if you have the opportunity to help me, great. If you have the opportunity to help me and you don't multiple times in a row, then maybe I'll rebalance at that point. But I definitely come into it with, putting my best self forward first.
Oh, that's great. And so, what advice would you give to others looking to build their network for the first time? Where do you start?
Yeah, find people for which you have a common affinity, whether it's a niche area of research or, attending the same conference, and find a way to collaborate on a research project or to share in a research initiative or some way to work together. I think that's usually the best way. I always joke, I used this phrase maybe a decade ago at Black Hat, where I did a session for people who were attending Black Hat for the first time. And I had this slide and I said, find your carpet club. And I described Carpet Club as the group of people at the conference for which you're willing to grab a Red Bull and go sit on the floor in the hallway or in the corner of this convention and talk about really cool shit. And I've always been a Carpet Club guy. Like the first conference I went to, I found some really cool people and we sat in the corner of this dangy hotel and had fascinating conversations. And the funny part was that I gave that presentation. That concept was super well received. I talked about a lot of other things in the industry as well. And then that was at Black Hat. You fast forward a couple of days later to DEF CON, and I was sitting on the carpet with two close friends that I've collaborated with for over 20 years, Jeff Moss, the founder of Black Hat and DEF CON, and my friend Jason Healy. And somebody came up and said, "Oh, look, it's your carpet club," right? Like they recognize it, like I was practicing what I preach. So same thing. When I bring interesting people into that community, especially if they don't have a nexus with cybersecurity, and I've brought the journalists and I've brought film producers and others, and I'll always be like, look, part of this is we're just going to go sit and chat and share a common passion. And at these hacker events, you see people open up their laptops and solve a challenge. I mean, that's one thing I love about DEF CON is you always have these challenge badges, or you have
Mm-hmm.
Caesar's challenge, which you're trying to solve to get an invite to his party. And those require collaboration. There's like this forced collaboration. I see that with my kids who now attend DEF CON, where they'll like team up with people on cracking the badge that they don't know. And then somebody will walk by and be like, "Hey, are you working on the badge? Can I join you?" And they make the circle a little bigger. So it really is about being community minded and wanting to learn from others and wanting to share your knowledge. That's really going to be the best basis for building out that community.
Wow. Now, having two young kids, how do I encourage them to get into hacking and computer savvy? Because
Show them the cool stuff, like I never put my kids on a path for cybersecurity, but I definitely showed them the cool things. We talked about privacy and data aggregation and that sort of
mm-hmm.
stuff. I showed them how to pick locks. I mean, lock picking is a great gateway drug to learning cybersecurity, because like the same concept, but in a very tangible manner, where using your hands, and there's that huge sense of accomplishment when
Yeah.
you successfully get the lock to open. And then that gets them thinking about, well, how can I apply this to other challenges? Are there other things that I can tinker with, or that I can test out different techniques and achieve some sort of accomplishment?
Oh, that's great. And so I'm assuming you get into some pretty gray areas, kind of legally and ethically speaking. And so how do you balance those boundaries in terms of where to go and where not to go?
Yeah, I've always been, on the good side, and that's come up with clients in the past,
Mm-hmm.
particularly around red teaming. When like, oh, geez, why should I trust your team? Like, you could get into my bank and you could steal all my money, and I have to tell them, like, look, if we wanted to get into your bank and steal your money, that's what we would do. And I'd be living on a beach in Belize, right? I wouldn't be coming to you with my hourly rate, asking you to sign all of this legal contract, including giving me an 18 USC waiver, right? That says you're authorizing me to hack into your environment. So I think that's the key piece. My generation had particular challenges around that kind of gray line. And the reason being is that we were passionate about technology, but the access to technology was very limited. You can go and buy a $300 computer these days and learn. You can install Linux on it. You can get all these free tools to do cybersecurity testing. Back then, really the only way to obtain access to systems was to get unauthorized access. So there were a lot of curious people that maybe access things that they shouldn't have. I never held that against folks, right? If they were doing it out of curiosity, if they were in that time frame in which we were growing up, it was expected. Now, where I did draw the line was if they did it for personal enrichment, if they did it
Mm-hmm.
for criminal reasons, if they did it for unethical reasons. Oh, I hacked into the phone company not to learn about how it works, but to listen in on my ex-girlfriend. That for me was where I would draw the line. Personally, I think I was able to escape from the allure of that environment because I was so rural. I mean, I really just was all alone up in Vermont. So I was working on my own computer a lot, trying to connect with anybody was a long distance phone call. It was different for me, isolated as the only person interested in computers, at age 14 in my little town of 150 people, than it was for people in Boston and New York, where they could go to the mall every, Thursday of the first Thursday of the month and meet people, or they could dial local, no cost, into a
Mm-hmm.
bulletin board system and connect with people. I early on, until I got to college and started traveling more, was somewhat isolated from that community at that point in time.
And what was your big aha moment out of childhood that set you down on this path?
I think, the kind of real aha moment I had around the value an opportunity associated with technology is that I had this Commodore 64, super, super basic computer. I was a hockey fan, and there was like no game to play hockey that was available. I mean, now you've got, multiple games across multiple platforms. So I sat down and wrote my own, and it was very simplistic. But my brother and my neighbor, like, we all got addicted to playing this little hockey game that I wrote. And I was just like, man, I created this, right? Like, I had an idea out of nothing. I created something that is tangible. Like, we're using our keyboard, we're controlling this game, it's, competing against each other and scoring and, just these elements of it. And for me, that was definitely a big aha moment where I was just like, man, this is a powerful tool, because it went from my mind to the screen and it actually worked, right? And I controlled 100% of the process. Like, 100% of the creative process was just me interacting in this very rudimentary basic language on the Commodore 64 to create this game that I wanted to exist in the world. And so I made it exist.
And so how did you even learn to do that though? You just picked up a computer and
100%
started?
self-taught. Yeah, no, at that time I was 100% self-taught. I had a couple of guidebooks, and then there was this great magazine at the time called Run Magazine, just RUN, because that was the command to get something to get code to actually execute. And the great thing about Run Magazine is it had pages and pages and pages of sample code. So I would
Mm,
every month hand type all of those pages of code to see what the programs would do and to learn. So I attribute, especially kind of like pre-junior, senior year of high school, where I actually had a computer science class that I was able to take, which was a
yeah.
story in of itself, with that magazine. And then I did connect to some bulletin board systems, even though it was long distance, and I would download code from folks and kind of learn what they were doing and play with it. So really early on, it was just me teaching myself.
Oh, that's so wild. I remember, I was around when the internet was invented and just that learning curve was so much. Yeah, you're beyond any expertise I would ever own.
Yeah,
um,
it's, the creativity part definitely appealed to me. And then the true hacker, mindset is that you want to figure out how things work in order to make them
yeah.
better. Sometimes better is more secure, sometimes better is better. So, all through time, that would be my focus. I'd be like, how does this work? How can I make it better? And I started to get tapped, in high school. I've told the story of my math teacher saw that myself and another student were interested in programming computers. And so he actually went to summer school, and he took the, for high school teachers, introduction to computer programming, and he taught us the course. And I think at that point in time, it was like, the student was stronger than the teacher, but he
Yeah.
had, like, I was getting credit to, like, program on the computer. And then the next summer, he went away again and came back and taught us, like, version 2 of it. And he had this little tiny lab in the back of the math room. And really the level of commitment to recognize the energy that we had, and to go himself and learn this in order to try and teach us. But there was a point in time where the school decided to move to computer-based report cards, and they
Hmm.
were having problems with the software. And the math teacher, which is my computer science teacher, tried to fix it, and he couldn't. And he brought me down to the principal's office, which is where this resided, right in the office right outside the principal's office. And he said, hey, we're having a problem with this. Can you take a look at it and see if you can fix it? And I'm just like, oh man, like, I have utility, I can be useful. It was also another interesting moment for me, because this teacher had this, like, really annoying quirk where if you asked him, can I go to the bathroom, he would say, you have that ability. And you would have to say, may I? And he would say, of course you may go to the bathroom, right? So it's like this quirky thing he did every time, right? That was just part of his personality. So he sits me down at this computer, says, fix this. And then he starts to leave. And I said, hey, wait a minute, I could change all of the grades in the system if I wanted to. And he goes, you have that ability. And he walked out the room. And I talked to folks about the power of trust and people trusting you, because that definitely was also a moment. I remember it, however, 35 years later, as impactful, because, like, oh, I've been given power, and I've also been
Yeah.
given trust. And it is super
Mm.
important to me to not
Hmm.
use that power to violate the trust. So I fixed the software and I didn't change my grades.
Great ending to that story.
Yeah.
All right. Now, fast forward into today. I mean, you're really shaping the minds of all the cybersecurity professionals. I mean, you serve on the independent expert review board for Black Hat, the world's largest cybersecurity conference this year. I was checking out the agenda. It looks really good. I might try and finagle my way into that this year. What are you most excited to see this year, and why?
There's so many talks that get submitted that, unlike the original years where you could review every talk, I only get to review maybe 12 to 15% of them. So the things that I'm excited about the most tend to be the original research, or the things that are focusing on cutting edge technology. I'll be spending a lot of time trying to get to the AI related talks and looking for those pockets of innovation, as there are new vulnerabilities being discussed, if there are speakers in particular organizations, I'll kind of try and drop in. I do admit, though, at Black Hat, um, being on the review board, I get the videos for free every year. So I'll go attend some of the talks, but I also focus a lot on the people component. I've been going to Black Hat since Black Hat #1. I have a tremendous amount of people in my network that's the only time of year I get to see them. So I
Mm-hmm.
also leave a lot of time for serendipity, where maybe I'm walking to go see a talk and I run into somebody that I haven't seen for a while or that I want to talk to, and we'll go get coffee and I'll miss the talk. And then I know I can go watch the video later. So I'm a little bit spoiled in that regard. And I think actually all the attendees get access to the video for like 30 days or something. So there'll be lots of great talks. It's incredibly hard to choose. As I mentioned, we get over 1,000 submissions now
Mm-hmm.
every year that are reviewed by hand by this board of independent experts. I love seeing the research that they're focused on, but to try
Mm-hmm.
not to pick any topical favorites. I'm also curious about the intersection with policy
Mm.
and the human factors, and I think there are some universal elements around cybersecurity that we need to give more attention to. So I'll give some focus to those topics as well. And then I put a bit of effort into my veteran scholarship program. I created 11 or 12 years ago, just a grassroots. It was actually just me. Was inspired by a friend in a coffee conversation that we had, where I was complaining about how the US government in particular had all of these cybersecurity positions that were open and unfilled. And I was like, man, why aren't we taking veterans, and as
Mm.
they transition out of the military service, getting them trained to fill these positions? And she looked at me and said, well, you're on the Black Hat board. Like, why aren't you doing that? And I was like, well, why aren't I doing that? So I took 2 passes that I had that were mine, to give away. And I just went on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook and said, if you're a transitioning veteran or know a transitioning veteran, fill out this Google sheet, and I've got 2 free passes to give away. And it was a resounding success. And the next year, a fellow board member said, that was a really cool initiative. I'm going to give you my 2 passes as well. So then I had 4 to give away. And then it started to grow from there to where now it's officially recognized as a scholarship program at Black Hat. And this year I'll give 30 passes away to veterans that are trying to transition into the cybersecurity industry. So I'll also spend some time getting to know those veterans and mentoring
Yeah.
them and connecting them with people. So even at events, as you can tell, my focus is going to kind of be people first, or people driven.
Oh, that's amazing. And so, where have you seen some of those folks go?
They go off into industry, into security operations centers and red teams, and just all sorts of crazy places. And I get some really great letters, some of which I'm not going to talk about because it'll make me cry on the air, but it's like where it's super life changing. People are at a point
Mm-hmm.
of desperation. They've lost this sense of mission. They can't find employment, and they get connected in this community, and now they are working on a mission and they have an
Mm-hmm.
employment, and they move down to their parents' house with their family. And just these super inspiring stories that come in, or the person who's like working as a mechanic and trying to get
Mm-hmm.
their security certifications at night. I always leave room for what I call kind of like my renegades, right? Where I read the application and I'm like, nobody else is going to bet on you. right? But there's
Oh.
something about you that I
Mm-hmm.
believe in, and so I'm going to make that bet. I did that the first year. One of the two people I selected was a weatherman for the Air Force. And a few folks looked at me like, I forget how many applicants I had, like 75 or 80. It was a pretty big number, and only two passes. And they're like, you picked this weatherman. Like, what's up with that? I said, if you dug deeply into what he was doing, being a weatherman meant he had to operate these weather stations for the Air Force. There were like these
Mm.
75 or 80 Linux boxes. And he wrote in his essay about how he got interested in cybersecurity because people were hacking these boxes. They were on the internet. And so he had to figure
Mm.
out how to harden them. So he became a really good kind of like secure system administrator. Then he's like, I have to figure out how people are seeing me. So he started red teaming himself and downloading like Kali Linux and stuff like that and targeting himself. So I tell people like, this guy's in the cybersecurity industry. He just doesn't know it. All we need to do is provide him with the opportunity to recognize that he already has the skills. And if we put him in front of the right people and in front of the, they obviously go to the briefings and get exposed to the content. And then I
Yeah.
set up networking events and happy hours and I bring people in. And he went on and became gainfully employed in the cybersecurity industry, right? So there's that. I love being a little bit of a rogue element and like
Mm-hmm.
nudging things in the right direction for people who maybe wouldn't get the benefit of the doubt otherwise.
And I'm sure there's so much power to that naming and claiming it, once you know what it's called and once you know that trajectory and career path, I'm sure it just makes a lot more sense and easier to go down.
And having the confidence, a lot of people see cybersecurity as having these huge barriers to entry. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, there's a lot of technical competence required, but it's also segmented and accessible, and there's on ramps. And a big part of it is getting these veterans to not be afraid, right? And that's not really a challenge anymore. I think the applications I get, like, they're all in. They're like, I want to do this. Like, I recognize I can do this, and they just are looking for that kind of boost in their career.
Oh, that's great. And now on the flip side, what are some of the most innovative technologies to come out of the conference that you've seen in the past?
Yeah, technology wise, really the focus of Black Hat is on exposing some of the security risk and kind of the innovative research. So I think when
Mm-hmm.
we look at technologies, obviously you could say that almost every solution that's come out in the past 20 years has some sort of nexus to Black Hat, but not because the technology was invented there, but because the risk was adequately
Mm.
articulated there. So if you think about the Charlie Millers of the world, right, with their targeting of NFC environments or targeting of automobiles, right? That's why we have Tesla and these other manufacturers showing up at DEF CON and saying, hack our
Mm.
car and running bug bounties. When you think about Dan Kaminsky, right, who is unfortunately now deceased, as a huge loss to our community, and his research on DNS, right, and DNS security and the mitigations associated with that,
Mm-hmm.
really it pushes the industry in a better direction by exposing the risks associated with these technologies and getting people to accept that the risk is something that they need to manage as part of the process of building these things. So sure, there've been like, cool endpoint entities and, network detection technologies, sure, but really the value of the conference is in making the community aware. And I remember in the early days, we used to get legal cease and desist letters. I remember sitting in a back room in one of the conference centers helping Jeff Moss and other people literally rip pages out of 3-ring binders, because these are the days back when Black Hat gave a binder because we got a cease and desist from a company, and that was the only route that we had. Now those same companies have bug bounty programs and responsible disclosure programs,
Mm.
and they'll pay security researchers to find vulnerabilities. They're not trying to squash their research, and they'll do through responsible disclosure, they'll be like, tell us about the vulnerability and let us fix it, and then we'll give you credit for discovering it, and you can go brief at Black Hat. But guess what? When you brief at Black Hat, it's not something that has the ability to harm us. It's something you can show the validity of the research and how you push the industry forward. So
Mm-hmm.
really, the industry as a whole has matured significantly over the past 20 plus years.
And just even in the past year, how have you seen the cybersecurity threat landscape change?
Well, I mean, I think the past year is a lot about the adoption of new technologies, and I think also the impact, augmenting the impact that geopolitics has as well, right?
Mm,
Geopolitics has always been kind of a hidden underbelly of cyber risk, but we're seeing that more and more. We see that today with the news around Russians operating, maligned influence bots on Twitter.
mm-hmm,
You see it with the conflict in Ukraine. You see it with North Korea financing their nuclear weapons development program through ransomware and large scale cyber attacks. Ransomware obviously continues to be a huge issue. We saw this like little decline in
mm-hmm,
2022, I think, partly because of the conflict in Ukraine and displacement. And then it doubled in 2023 and is probably going to double in 2024. And where you used to feel like the attackers were maybe a little bit respectful of the potential for impact on public safety, that
mm-hmm,
also seems to have gone away. There's more ransomware in hospitals. There's more ransomware in critical
mm.
infrastructure, right? So we're definitely seeing the trend line there with regards to the potential impact and consequences of some of these attacks. The techniques have stayed, fairly constant. That's the sad thing. I mean, you still have 0 days that come out, but people get whacked a lot of times on basic hygiene issues and basic security management type things, particularly with ransomware, not having their backups appropriately segmented so they can't recover from it. Uh, Certainly the migration away from like, we're going to encrypt all your files as ransomware, as backup got more robust, obviously the attackers pivoted and said, okay, well, we encrypted it, but we're also going to disclose them if you don't give us the
Mm-hmm.
ransom. So now, companies are in this position of catching stuff on the egress, to make sure that all of their data isn't stolen, or they have to pay the ransom, even if they have the backups, because they don't want their customer data or their proprietary sensitive data introduced into what is basically the public domain.
And I was just reading in your newsletter a couple of weeks ago that that's happening with Snowflake right now, that a lot of their customer data are being held hostage for millions of dollars, right?
Yeah, I think that's another aspect of this, right? The supply chain element, where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, if I'm an attacker, I can go after one company that interacts with hundreds of companies and then kind of downstream myself to hundreds of companies. So we certainly saw that with SolarWinds. You've seen
Mm-hmm.
that right now, it looks like with Snowflake. I mean, these supply chain type of attacks are certainly a huge issue.
And so, what advice do you have for companies on how they can better protect their data?
Ooh, that's a complex. The,
Loaded question.
yeah. I mean, the thing I definitely would say is that today, really, there are best practices and there's kind of common hygiene, and you can eliminate a lot of risk by just engaging in good security hygiene practices, right?
Mm-hmm.
By deploying common tooling. I mean, the endpoint detection technologies today are great, but you have to have them deployed. You have to have them configured properly. Uh, Threat intelligence is super prevalent, but you have to have the ability to consume and act on it. So really it is a lot about, security management and making sure that you're positioning your company and your culture, uh, and your teams to be successful in this space. I think that solves a lot. You're always going to have the risk of, some nation state entity using a 0 day against you, but that's not really the role that, security is designed to protect at its core. It's good to have tooling to detect if that happens, or detect the lateral movement associated
Mm-hmm.
with once that compromise happens. But it's unreasonable for a company to expect that they can protect against a 0 day not known, previously developed by a sophisticated nation state actor that's willing to invest millions of dollars in targeting you. The good
Mm-hmm.
news is that it takes millions of dollars and they need to be very targeted. So for a lot of organizations, most organizations, you can just protect against the known threats. I always tell folks, if you're vulnerable at all to CISA's KEV database, the known exploited vulnerabilities, that's like a roadmap. The vulnerability exists and we have evidence that the attackers are using it in the wild. Like that's like
Yeah.
mitigation 101, right? Like, so start there if you don't have anything. The NIST cybersecurity framework, right? Looking at
Mm-hmm.
your organization from the perspective of MITRE ATT&CK, right? There's great technologies being built out there right now that will help companies organize their whole security program around MITRE ATT&CK and the associated controls. Have one called Tidal Cyber that's building in my startup studio in Reston. Right, so taking advantage of those new approaches, but the existing frameworks, and doing what should be expected of you, in managing these networks. The companies I feel the sorriest for are the older companies that have a lot of legacy systems, right? We have a lot of tech debt, and there's a lot of legacy platform security issues. And the reality is you can't just snap your fingers and deploy a magic tool and solve those problems. There's a lot of companies that are on a multi-year journey. And that's also just the nature of rapid technology progress and the fact that these companies have been using technology for over 20 years.
Yeah. And so, how should companies prioritize their cybersecurity investments to kind of balance compliance, but also protection of new threats?
Yeah, I think you got to cover the basic blocking and tackling first, right? So if you can't legitimately say that you've got, a robust security program that takes you to that 95% solution, you got to revisit some things. If you reach that point and you are looking to make additional investments, I'm a big fan of, we talked about some of these new risk management frameworks. I'm a big fan of deception technologies that give you advanced warning around an attacker in your network. I'm a big fan of utilization of threat intelligence. And then I'm a huge fan, given that I built a company around it, of engaging in red teaming and adversary simulation. So don't just count on the fact that you have a plan and that the implementation has gone as expected. Go out and validate that. Use the third party to emulate a real attacker and to see whether your implementation expectations match, what you have on paper. So get that ground truth from somebody who can emulate a real attacker for you.
Oh, that's great. And then if you think of a company that's kind of in that pre-IPO emerging growth stage, all the way to maybe a mature enterprise level company that has multiple systems and in-house cyber team, what in your mind, you've already touched on a lot of the basics, but what are the foundational elements of a cybersecurity program? And then how do you right size for that as you grow and think about adding to your cyber team?
Yeah, I think, a lot of organizations are faced with outsourcing, in the early stages to, an MSP. So I would say have a security aware MSP, right? Have a MSSP, which is helping you specifically with the security aspect of it. Have individuals in the organization for which responsibility is their primary role. Maybe you don't need to have a CISO, but you should have people in the organization that are responsible for that. You should be looking at the frameworks that exist. We talked about NIST. We talked about MITRE ATT&CK. There's cloud security frameworks. There's policy configuration guidelines. Like there's so much information available that can help you kind of fine tune and right size your organization. Utilization of cloud technologies. I think trying to run your own mail server is a mistake in today's day and age. Why not push that pain to Microsoft and Google and some of these other providers? I think Alex Stamos, when he was the CISO at Facebook, put it best. He's like, why would I run my own Exchange servers? I'll let Microsoft run them for me. I can only patch once a month. They can patch whenever they want, right? They own the operating system. They own the application, right? They are seeing all the attacks against my peers and my competitors and other highly targeted organizations, and they can develop the threat intelligence and protect me from it. So taking advantage of those technologies, I think is great. And then also the recognition, the role that the endpoint plays. I think, as an attacker, firewalls and perimeter security controls are necessary, but we can always circumvent them. We can always get that foothold in the organization. So how well are you protecting the individual employee endpoints? How well are you segmenting your network, right? So to make that lateral movement hard. So being able to solve for some of those problems, I think, early on in an organization is great. And then as you get up to the larger organizations, same thing. You have to have a team for which their dedicated role is cybersecurity, and they have to have an appropriate voice at the table. I've seen security teams that are basically kind of alienated. Oh, you guys just go manage the firewall. You go manage our antivirus if something happens. But in reality, they should be at the table when you're thinking about that new technology deployment for the CTO, when you're thinking about the CIO's new
Mm-hmm.
application that they're going to be funding, when the board is talking about managing cyber risk. Now, thankfully, the SEC is forcing that function at the board level a bit for us over the past couple of years, but they have to be empowered, right? Security has to have a voice, and most importantly, security needs to be part of the design
Mm-hmm.
process. I tell this story often when I present and speak in public of being hired to do the red team of a satellite communication provider. So they're going to be providing IP services over satellites. So kind of like a Starlink, but many years ago. And we went in and did the original proposal, and we got selected as part of the final three. So we went in and gave the verbal proposal and the Q&A, and that went well at orals, and we got selected for the job. So we went in and we had the kickoff meeting, and they gave us like 800 pages worth of documentation of the technology they were building and how it was going to work. And we took it back to our offices, and then I went back to the CISO and said, okay, we're ready to come bang on this thing in the lab. And he looked at me and was like, what do you mean bang on it in the lab? I'm like, we understand how it works. We have some ideas on how it might be vulnerable. We want to go test those, ideas out against the platform so we can tell you, how to mitigate it. He looks at me and goes, Matt, the satellite's already in orbit. We went through this whole process with us thinking that they were bringing us in early on, and he was bringing us in after the satellite was already in orbit. And so I had to gently explain that the value that we could provide as red teamers was greatly diminished by the fact that the satellite was in orbit, right? Like I can't send my
Right.
team to space. Now we could still look at communication protocols and the ground station and, the ICS elements of the satellite that they could control from the ground, but really bringing us in as that technology was being developed would have been the right approach. So anybody that's building any sort of platform, any sort of technology, I always say, make sure security is part of your design principle. Luckily today we have entities like CISA articulating the same thing with,
Mm-hmm.
they're secure by design, with the software bill of lading and understanding where your software components are coming from, and auditing the open source libraries and the Git libraries and the things that you're building upon. But it is a topic that requires deliberate placement in the organization and deliberate attention from the leadership as well.
And so now your advice to a CISO, what is your biggest allies, I would say, in an organization at the C-suite level to get that buy-in and support?
Yeah, I mean, you have to have the executive buy-in because operationally, day to day,
Mm-hmm.
the executives are operating the company, but you also have to have the board buy-in, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's where one of the areas where we have a really huge gap right now. There's so many boards that don't understand cybersecurity. I've literally had boards of directors pull me aside when I've been there with the CISO to jointly brief on something, and they'll be like, "Hey, I feel like we're being held hostage here. We don't understand what's going on." Right? So part of that is got like shame on them. You put a guy like me on your board, and I'll help you understand and translate the same
Mm-hmm.
way that you have other domain specific board members. But those are very protected positions. But you need to make sure that if you're the CISO, that you are able to articulate to the board the value that you're providing, and that you're providing
Mm-hmm.
meaningful metrics to them, that you're tracking on a quarterly basis, that as there are incidents that are happening, that you're demonstrating the effective management of those incidents, that you have a planning process in place. I think also demonstrating that you understand the ROI on the decisions that you're making from a funding perspective. We
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately operated here recently in an era in which you had major banks saying, as far as cybersecurity is concerned, there is no upper bound on budget. So guess what? That's BS, right?
Right.
You don't have infinite money. And when I was at Accenture, one of the things I did was go talk to the CISOs about the fact that, like, let's figure out how to optimize your security program. Let's look at everything that you're spending and make sure you're spending it on
Mm.
the right things. And is there duplicative spending, or is there a control that's so important that it should have a second layer associated with it? But let's stop with this year over year 25% increase in your budget, because it's not
Yeah.
sustainable. The other piece too that I think is important is that CISOs tend to be focused on the security and the technology, but they need to
Mm-hmm.
develop a really core understanding of the business. My friend Neil talks about being in a meeting with the CISO and the board, and the CISO's given this great presentation, and then one of the board members says, excuse me, can you tell me how we make money? And the CISO didn't have an answer, right? So how are you managing risk in an organization if you don't understand fundamentally how the business operates? So it isn't just that we can blame the boards and the executives and I'm not getting the attention. You need to really develop an understanding for how your company does business, because you're going to be expected to propose and make value judgments on how to protect the best interests of that business. So it's a bi-directional level of effort that's required.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, like as you said, the SEC is recently pushing this more onto the boards. Can you give us a bit of an overview on that for those
Really,
who might not be up to speed?
I think, if you're on a board and you're not up to speed, you're probably being a bit negligent. So I would encourage you to go get yourself intimately familiar with what the SEC is doing. They pulled back a little bit, actually, as a result of some industry feedback. I think, originally the SEC draft had said that they wanted the boards to appoint a person on the board who was the cybersecurity lead. Now they've kind of pulled back and said, okay, well, the board needs to help manage this process, and we're going to put some mandatory reporting requirements around it. If you have an incident, you have to report that. If you have something that happens that has some materiality associated with it, you have to, include that in there. You're responsible for, they put additional responsibilities from a board perspective on managing security. And there are even politicians, and I don't give a lot of credence to the politicians, but there's some political action recently that is saying, like, hey, boards, you should be accountable if you hire a CISO that doesn't have the right credentials, right? I mean, that hasn't reached the SEC layer, but you see kind of that type of stuff happening. So really, I think what's going to happen is you're going to eventually have these boards migrate to where cybersecurity is a dedicated position, or they have a dedicated advisor. I fill that role with some companies where I go in as the security, I call it security fiduciary, which is a term I borrowed from the financial services industry. That means I'm there just to represent the board's interest in cybersecurity with no ulterior motive. I can't refer companies in. I can't take referrals. I mean, a financial fiduciary is legally obligated to not recommend you invest in a fund if they're getting a kickback or if it's not in your best interest. So we kind of frame things as like, we'll be your security fiduciaries that you can ask questions of, can interact with your team. So I think we'll see more of that, where the boards bring in these dedicated outside advisors to help them navigate these issues. I think we'll see the placement of cybersecurity people on boards of directors where it's fundamentally important, right? It's not appropriate for all companies, but for some companies where managing their cyber risk is just such a huge component of the business, I think you'll start to see some of those dedicated positions. And I think they should expect that the heat is only going to increase from entities like the SEC. I think that things have changed quite a bit with the reporting requirements and the identification of them having some sort of security plan. And I think the individual kind of accountability, I think we can expect will, emerge at some point in the coming years as well.
And this also lands now on the plate of the CFO. So how should they be thinking about cybersecurity?
Yeah, it's really about that understanding what business operations you're trying to protect, right? And at the executive level, you want to make sure you have a fundamental program. It's like just the general hygiene / the systems are operating, but you also are trying to make sure that you're not having an attack that I usually just categorize them as catastrophic. Obviously, catastrophic is really bad, or consequential, right? Like it's impacting your customers, it's impacting your share value, it's impacting your budgets, right? You're trying to prevent those types of attacks, which means the CFO should be having that conversation about the ROI on cybersecurity. They should be thinking about, are they investing in the right technologies? Are they investing too little? Sometimes it's too much, right? Like they're a valid part of the conversation now, just because of the budget, allocation requirements and understanding. Because the same way that I believe that the executive team and the boards are obligated to spend the enough money on security, I also think they're obligated to not spend too much, right? Because there is the danger of excess, right? Or what in the DoD landscape. We have had this concept of defense in depth. You see it in the private sector now, but I remember one analyst referring to it as expense in depth, where these teams are just going to Black Hat and RSA and saying, well, I'll just buy one of everything. And then I'm being diligent. Well, that's also, not being diligent, because you're not being a good custodian of customer, shareholder, dollars in the system.
Now, you mentioned catastrophic, but going down to materiality, how do you define materiality in context of this new disclosure? And what advice do you have for companies?
That's the $1 million question, right? What is material? It's going to vary from organization to organization. And I think that's the conversation that boards need to be having, is what does material mean to us? If customer data is lost, that falls into a privacy category where there could be downstream liability. We see a lot of class action lawsuits and the like, right? So I think that would be material. If we lost proprietary data or critical intellectual property that isn't, consumer based, it doesn't have that PII component, that is also material. We invested R&D dollars, and you invest R&D to get ahead of competition and to make sure you can compete in certain markets, and you're losing that capability. If you're incurring costs, right, that are substantial associated with a potential incident, if you're paying a ransom, if there's the risk that data was taken off your network that could be put in the public domain, those all seem to me like those are material breaches, but I can't define it for companies writ large. I think business by business, they need to sit down and understand, of all of these potential impact buckets, which ones are material to us.
Yeah. And then in terms of the response time, say you're a CFO, how do I know that my security team is identifying cybersecurity threats on a timely basis?
Yeah, well, first off, you're going to see with real threat actors what's happening, but this is also the role that red teaming can play. I'm a big fan of time to detection as one of the most significant metrics you can report to executive teams and boards. And that just means, let's say in the red teaming context, I'm an attacker. I get you to click on a spearfishing email. That's my initial attack vector. How quickly does the organization, and at what stage of the attack does the organization detect that they're under attack? And then how efficiently do they mitigate that attack? There's a huge difference in whether you detect me in 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 weeks, or 5 months. And unfortunately, we see in a lot of organizations these super long dwell times where the attacker is present on the network undetected for long periods of time. That to me is just a great metric you can dial in on and say, we need to take that number down. Like it needs to get down to a manageable level. You don't want to rely on real life attackers to constantly be taking that measure. So having a recurring red team also serves as that, element of it. The red team can go in and they can, even move laterally, access data, exfiltrate data, accomplish their mission, but then they can, because they're working with you and you can move this from like red to purple teaming, they can start to dial things up. They can start to become a little noisier, a little bit more obnoxious, engage in riskier behavior. And then when they get detected, then you say like, that's the halt line. Okay, we were detected here. But then the second element of that is once detected, how efficient is your response? Do you understand what you're looking at, the consequences of what the attacker has achieved? Do you have the tooling in place, the logging, et cetera, to be able to determine what the attacker did while they were on your network, right? And do you have the ability to efficiently expel or control the attacker from doing additional bad or additional harm, right? So tracking those types of efficiencies is also important. If I go in, I'm like, haha, I detected you. You just escalated privileges on my domain controller in my environment and we caught you. Success, right? And we mitigated it. We kicked you off the domain controller, but they don't have the tooling to go and look at the 12 systems I compromised on my lateral movement through there and the other data and databases and things that I got access to, or the other domain controller that I compromised, but I went stealthy, right? You have to have that efficiency of response as a kind of a key thing that you're looking at as well.
And to kind of help educate the layman business user, can you explain kind of red teaming, purple teaming, and those concepts in 0 day?
Yeah, I mean, 0 day is easy, right? It's the day that the vulnerability is exploited is the first time that it's known.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that is like it's a secret tool. I have a way in which I'm going to attack you that is there's no patch exists because nobody knows that this vulnerability exists. I've developed the exploit for it. And then
Mm-hmm.
when it hits you the first time, that's kind of like day zero, right? Like it's super hard to protect against that, with the exception of I can develop my kind of downstream protections. I can look for escalation and lateral movement and exfiltration and kind of all
Mm-hmm.
these things that attackers also need to do beyond that initial exploit. Sometimes that initial 0 day is just bad, right? Like if it's targeting an external server or environment where it's just like okay, like there's no other opportunities for detection, like that I'm kind of compromised. So that's the 0 day is it's not known in the public domain, and the first time that you're seeing it is when the attacker is successfully using it against the environment. Red teaming really is when you are having usually you have internal red teams, but the most useful ones are going to be external, right? Because they can bring in lessons learned from other organizations. They're doing that as their full-time job, and they maybe are going to be super innovative. They are being put in a position to emulate the bad guy, the red forces, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
in cybersecurity you kind of call that the red element of it, and they're in a perfect world going to emulate what a real attacker would do. They're going to use the same tactics, techniques, and procedures that a real attacker would use against your organization. And this is important too, that they're also going to emulate the goal of the attacker. Too often I see red teams come in and they just look for what's the low hanging fruit and how do I do something cool, when in
Mm-hmm.
reality you have to contextualize it even further based on what type of company this is. What is the threat actor going to look to accomplish? They're not just attacking you for giggles. They're trying to steal money or get access to property or ransomware you, right? They have a goal. Like the
Yeah.
adversary is not a 1 or a 0. They're a real living human being on the other side that is trying to accomplish something. So you need to emulate what they're trying to accomplish, because if you do that as a red teamer, you'll be emulating kind of like the kill chain or the attack chain that they're going to
Mm-hmm.
pursue. I'm not going to go after this little stupid R&D server that's got nothing important on it. I'm going to go
Right.
after your core intellectual property, or I'm going to go after that R&D server only because it lets me laterally move, right? You
Yeah.
have to understand what the attacker is going to target. So then the defenders that are on your network that are trying to prevent the bad from happening and managing
Mm-hmm.
the security of your overall IT environment, that's your blue team, right? So blue defense, red offense. Uh, Purple is when the two work together, where you come together and say, okay, I'm trying to defend against you. I wasn't successful. Why wasn't I? Help me figure out what you
Mm-hmm.
did here. I thought that I had tooling in place that would protect me from this, and it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Is it configured wrong? Do I have the sensor turned up too high and it's generating all these false positives and my team has learned to ignore them? Or do I have it turned down too low and we just kind of missed you as you were passing through? So the purple team is when it becomes collaborative, and the blue team looks to go and improve their security posture based on the understanding that the red team brings around how they targeted the environment. So you see a lot of these exercises move to purple team type modes
Mm-hmm.
because it's the best way to, hey, and we started the conversation out this way, to collaborate, right?
Right.
It's really about getting the two teams talking together to learn from each other. And oftentimes you'll find that there are defenses that you can put in place that are simply configuration changes, or you had this tool, but you didn't have this mode enabled and you just need to enable that mode. And I'm amazed over the years at how much we're able to improve a client's security posture just by
Mm-hmm.
getting them to use the things they've already paid for, the investments that they've already made, in a more efficient manner.
No, that's so interesting. And now you've coined the term HackThink, which I think kind of ties into a lot of these concepts. Can you explain
Mm-hmm.
that?
Yeah, HackThink was just my way of saying that hackers frame things from a unique perspective, right? That you look at the totality of the system and then you take it down into its component parts. and you see how they interact with each other, and then you're looking for ways to kind of make it better. And better could be that you're trying to make it more secure, or better could be you're just trying to do things differently. I started using HackThink, though, not really as a way to communicate with my fellow cybersecurity professionals, but to communicate with people that weren't cybersecurity folks. Because for me, I had this kind of aha moment again, kind of a decade ago, where I realized that the hacker mindset could be applied to problems that just aren't technology problems. So I use that to try and inspire people to think about using a hacker mindset to solve problems that are not cybersecurity or technology related, right? Looking at the holistic system, looking at the component parts, how can they be exploited? How can they be made stronger? How can they be re-engineered? And so when I speak at community events, I'll often include that call to arms where I'll say like, hey, it'll be a huge shame if the hacker mindset is only ever used to solve hacking problems or solve cybersecurity problems, because it can be used for so much more beyond that.
And one kind of use case that pops to my mind is really the role of internal audit. And we work a lot with, audit professionals who are looking to audit cyber programs, cybersecurity programs. And so what is your kind of advice for them in terms of how to approach viewing a cybersecurity program?
Yeah, I mean, audit's a great function. I'll be honest and admit that over the course of my career, I didn't work with a lot of audit teams.
Yeah.
But it is, I mean, when we talk about accountability and verification of controls and, that audit function, that's the role that they play. So to the extent that audit gets more engaged in cybersecurity, I think that's a good thing. And also when we talk about the board reporting, almost every board has an audit committee and has a person that is appointed as the chair of that audit committee, and they have recurring reports that come in. So it's also a good way to kind of like grassroots cybersecurity back into the board level conversations as well, while making sure that your systems, from a cybersecurity perspective, that your systems and programs are executing as expected. There's a role for red teaming in audit. I've done some of those where the red team comes in on behalf of the audit team to just validate the implementation of controls, to validate the detection capability. They don't want the security organization to know that the testing is taking place. So a great role from that perspective for audit as well.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of NIST framework audits as part of the audit plan. And so what would you say would be a second follow-on that they should focus on and do next?
Yeah, so frameworks are great, but then I think you want to do the technical validation, right? So getting a red team company to come in and say, okay, according to the framework, here's what we're doing. Let's go see, does the implementation match the aspirations, right? A framework is a very aspirational approach to security. I have something that I'm following. I'm going and implementing my program according to it, but the implementation is the part that always trips people up. So what we want to do is validate the implementation of those frameworks. So the framework is a great way for everyone to level set and say, we understand the business that we're in. We understand what information we're trying to protect. We understand what our goals and what success looks like. We understand what decisions we've made by way of technologies that we're going to deploy to protect against these risks that we've identified. And we've gone out and we've deployed those technologies, and now we're managing them. And then the kind of the audit functions to come in and say, okay, let's validate that, right? And that can be a paper drill. You can go around and interview people, and it often is. Or you can also have the hands-on keyboard component where you're like, okay, let's go see, this control is in place. Let's make sure that it's actually executing as expected. And so there's, a great function there as well.
And can you give us like a tangible use case of that?
A tangible use case
of a control that you think an auditor would go in and test and validate?
Yeah, for certain. I mean, the existence of endpoint detection, the existence of mitigation for vulnerabilities that are identified within the organization, right? Like almost everybody's running some sort of internal vulnerability scanning, and they're
Mm-hmm.
developing programs and issuing tickets. And so, if they say that a vulnerability is patched, you can go and actually validate that it's patched. If they say that they've got endpoint detection on all of the endpoints in the organization, you can go and validate that. If they claim that they have a control around network segmentation, and if I compromise the system of somebody in HR, you technically shouldn't be able to move in our network to the engineering department with all of our critical IP. You can go and validate that those controls exist. So there's lots of controls that can be validated. There's also things, where and this gets back to red teaming and understanding how you might already be performing a function but not realizing the security value. I give you an example of a red team we did against a big bank, and the bank had a VPN environment that was literally, the domain was vpn.bankname.com. And so we did what all good
That's
red
not
teamers
recommended.
do. No, I mean, it's okay, but we went and did what all good red teamers do, and we registered the domain vpnbankname.com. And what's missing there was the dot between VPN and bank name.
Mm-hmm.
And if you understand human behavior and the psychology of security, you recognize that we're going to try and target your employees with a URL that's missing a dot and hope that they don't notice. So we launched this big campaign to do spearfishing against VPN accounts, and we're hugely successful. And it resulted in us being able to compromise in totality the operations of the bank, right? So just this register of the domain, obviously we had to do the spearfishing, we had to have the payload, we had to have the lateral movement, but like it
Mm-hmm.
was bad stuff, right? It was a bad consequence, um, undetected. Here's the irony: is that 24 to 48 hours after registering vpnbankname.com without the little magic dot
Mm-hmm.
subdomain, we got a cease and desist from the legal team over a trademark violation. We ignored it, but if that trademark violation had been shared with their security operations center, hey, here are the domains that we've identified that we believe are violating our trademark, a person looking at that could have easily identified what we were trying to do, and they could have just blocked it. They could have just blocked that domain, and they could have been on alert, and they would have known, like, hey, there's an attack vector coming against our VPN. So they were already paying to collect the information. They were already paying to action the information by sending out the cease and desist, but they weren't sharing it internally. So I think that's also, right, a key element, that you can identify these inefficiencies in the organization writ large, or they're like trademark violations against our domains. It's not a cybersecurity issue. Guess what? In this
It could be.
instance, it exactly could be, right. And there's no cost for you to send a copy of all these cease and desist letters, or just the list of domains that your platform that you're paying for has identified that are trademark violations, and sending those across the transom.
Wow. Yeah. And just highlighting the importance of collaboration at the executive level and communication.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, for folks who don't know, can you kind of talk us through kind of what spearfishing is, lateral movements, some of these key principles in cybersecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. Spearfishing is just, everybody's got it in their inbox, where I'm doing a very targeted email to try and convince you to engage in some sort of risky behavior. It might be that I'm trying to get you to visit a website and enter credentials. It could be I'm trying to get you to open an attachment. But it's typically somewhat targeted, right? Like I'm going after you, and I'm just like, hey, I noticed that cross country just announced this new practice. Here's a report I did that I think you'll find super interesting, right? So they're taking the time to do the research and figure out a way in which you can be successful. You have the spear being the little bit more focused approach to just phishing, where in phishing I might just say, I'm going to send out, I've got a mailing list that I bought on the dark web with 5 million people on it. And I'm going to send out a Bank of America, phishing attack. And I don't know that everybody's a Bank of America customer. I'm just banking on like 5% or 10% being it. Or I'm targeting your organization and I'm targeting everybody in the same way. Whereas the spearfishing narrows it down and is taking advantage of human behavioral elements, right? Because the human element in cybersecurity risk is also like a key thing here. When we talk about lateral movement, it's as simple as saying like, okay, if I've spearfished you successfully, and
Hmm.
now I've got software deployed on your laptop that gives me control over your laptop, that's not good, right? Like I'm reading your
Hmm.
emails, I'm accessing your files. But to be, impactful at the enterprise level, I need to compromise more than just your laptop. And I probably
Hmm.
need to compromise elements of your infrastructure, your server environment, maybe, routers and switches along the way. And in order to do that, I need to move from your machine to other machines on the network. That's the lateral movement where I
Hmm.
have
Okay.
to I have to extend my attack beyond just compromising an individual machine, and I now need to move into other elements of your environment. There's a detection point there, right? Because now I'm on your internal network, I'm targeting other systems, I'm probably going to be doing some scanning, I'm probably going to be exploiting vulnerabilities, I'm probably going to be trying credentials that are a mismatch, I might be trying default credentials on infrastructure. Like there are opportunities for detection as I move from your machine into other elements of the infrastructure. And when we talk about that lateral movement detection, that's what we're talking about.
Oh, that's so helpful. I actually, that happened to me. I was closing on a house and we had all of our mortgage documents. And I got this email that said, "Hey, we're ready to wire the funds. You need to send it to this bank account." And it was literally everybody on the title company. They had, luckily, like we clicked
Sure.
down in it and the emails we noticed were not the same, but they had replicated everybody on our team. They had the exact information of our mortgage closing. They even texted me to follow up. They even sounded like our realtor. Like it was just
Yep.
wild how well orchestrated it was. And I could have so easily fallen for it. And that would have been the end of my life savings, you know?
And who was compromised? It was your mortgage agent, or like, who had the data around the fact that you were entering into this mortgage?
Yeah, great question. I have no idea. So it could have
Okay.
been the title company. I obviously escalated it to the title company, the realtor. Nobody ever got back to me in terms of who had that vulnerability. Was it a personal, attack on our Gmail accounts? Like, I would love your
Mhm.
thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, we see that, there's a whole attack vector called business email compromise, where attackers get in and they just read people's email and then they try and craft spearphishing campaigns based on what they're reading. And obviously, if I'm reading your real email, I can
Hmm.
craft something that's a super realistic attack. So if I'm, at your mortgage company and I've got that person's email compromised, I'm reading all of the details around the property that you're buying, the way that you're paying for it, who your real estate agent is, like all that stuff. And then I can engage in that targeting of you. And oftentimes I can do it from their legitimate email address, right? Because I've
Hmm.
compromised their system. So that's common. We also see it where individuals get compromised, and the attackers are reading their email, and then they just come from an external vector to try and convince them to engage in behavior. Obviously, reading your email doesn't give me access to your bank account and your two-factor authentication for your bank, but reading your email tells me that you started signing a mortgage, and I can pretend to come in from the outside and elicit that,
Hmm.
that action. I can convince you to do it. It is a super, super common attack vector. We see it all the time. I see it from small mom and pop companies to billionaires. I've literally worked
Mm.
business email compromise for billionaires, where like millions and millions of dollars was wired out before it was caught. There are instances of that are in the public domain where Google and Facebook lost $100 million each, right? And that wasn't even
Mm.
business email compromise. That was just somebody who knew who their vendors were and how to contact the person responsible for vendors, and was able to convince them to change the payment account. So they didn't change the invoicing. They didn't generate fake invoices. They just said, "Hey, we changed banks and we need to update, where you send payments when we invoice you." And then they waited for legitimate vendors to invoice them, and then the invoices were paid, to the wrong bank accounts. So you see it over and over and over again, where if the attackers have access to personal information, to your real-time
Hmm.
communications, they can craft something that's super specific. Um, that, years ago I was targeted with a 0 day. So it makes me feel like I'm, valued by the threat actor, with a spearfishing campaign. And they did it at the time. I was an adjunct professor at Georgetown. So I had a Georgetown email address, and they researched and, found my Georgetown email. That's not hard. It was posted on the website at Georgetown. But then they figured out who I collaborated with at Georgetown. And they were like, oh, well, there's this professor, Professor Hoffman, who's also a counterterrorism guy. And they've written stuff together, and they've been on panels together. And let's go in and pretend to be Professor Hoffman and send it to his Gmail address. So you're kind of like creating that, that kind of outside, it was an adjunct role. I was CEO of a company. I was not a professor not to make money and not as my full-time employment. So I came in over that adjacency as opposed to trying to target my business email account, which maybe would have additional protections or do a little bit more scrutinizing of. And they basically pretended to be Bruce and sent me a thing that said, hey, Matt, I'm working on this project. I really would love your feedback on it. Please see the attached. And it would have worked. But there was one thing the attackers couldn't predict, and that was just that semester. It happened to be that when I taught my class, I entered into a classroom that Bruce Hoffman was vacating. His class was ending. And so I saw him every week. And we said our hellos and exchanged information. I said, you know what? Bruce is not going to send me something like this without mentioning it in person. He would have said, hey, I'm going to send you an email, or hey, I'm working on this thing. I'd love your feedback, watch for an email. So I called him. I said, hey, did you just send me an email? And he said, no. And I was like, oh boy. So when I brought that into my team and we detonated it in a lab and we saw what C2 it connected to, and it was a 0 day, and it was a super consequential 0 day that was used to target a Fortune 500 company a couple weeks later. So the fact that I saw it first, I was kind of like, wow, man, they really don't like me. But that was the one thing. Like, they did their research, they came up with a great attack vector, but then to my benefit, they didn't recognize, and how could they, that I was teaching a class in the same classroom as Bruce, and it was going to raise my spidey sense that he hadn't mentioned this to me at all semester, but he wanted my input on this big new project he was working on. It just didn't fit.
Yeah, but most people wouldn't even think twice about that and just click on the link. And so what hope is there for the rest of us? And I feel like people are the weakest link to cybersecurity. Yeah. And so what advice and guidance do you have for us?
Yeah. I mean, part of it is, like, unfortunately, you have to be a little bit paranoid. We need to be able to take advantage of these technologies and use them for business, but also be a little suspicious. And the reality is, if you go and do the study of some of these successful attacks, our gut intuition is almost always right. Almost always encounter somebody who's like, oh, I knew there was something wrong, but I didn't want to be rude, or I didn't want to get in trouble, or I wanted it to be true. That's why you won an iPod or an iPad spearfishing is so successful. And that's why Nigerian Prince spearfishing was successful. As blatant as the lie was, we psychologically want it to be true, right? Like, social engineering is successful because we're wired to want to believe the lie, right? So if you understand your basic psychology, that it's okay that you want it to be true, but recognizing like it trigger. I talked about spidey sense, right? Like, it triggered my spidey sense. So that's one element of it, right? Like, if you're a user, you obviously, there's things you can do. You can engage in good hygiene. You can, make sure you're updating. You can enable multi-factor authentication. You can use a password manager that allows you to have complex passwords. You can use hardware tokens if you want to be, really paranoid, like a YubiKey or something of that nature. So you have a role that you can play, and then you can report when you think things are suspicious. Organization is a little bit more complex, right? Because you're managing these unique workforces that are incredibly diverse in not only who they are, their experiences, the way they interact with people, but also their role in the organization, right? Like, spearfishing someone in HR is the easiest thing, because guess what? They get paid to look at PDF files from strangers all day, right? It's in their job function. So are you going to get angry with your HR team person that opened this malicious PDF? No, you build controls around that. The other piece too is, like, security awareness and training for cybersecurity has become super commoditized. It's like, oh, you've got to watch this PowerPoint presentation, and oh, I'm going to do like random spearfish testing against you. And if you fail, I'm going to send you to a video for the next half hour that you have to watch. And then you print your little certificate that I did this, I was compliant. Really what we've found over the years, and this is in my research, I
Mm-hmm.
have a very dear friend, Masha Sadova, who built and managed the program at Salesforce, is that employees actually respond better to security training and awareness programs that are gamified. They
Mm.
respond better to positive incentives than negative incentives. Don't punish me by making me watch a video when I click on the spearfishing. Give me security perks when I actually report something as spearfishing. Uh, Give me a leaderboard where I can, achieve rank and I can gamify these things. Give me perks that are meaningful, give me the t-shirt, give me the gift card. They even had a parking pass where, like, if you were like the security, leaderboard of the month, you
Ambassador.
got the reserve parking pass right next to the CEO, right? Like, what better flex than that,
Yeah.
They would give spot awards. If somebody tried to tailgate you and you challenged them, you'd get some sort of spot award, right? So, like,
Oh, great.
recognizing that the psychology of gamification and positive incentives is even more valuable than kind of the negative compliance based approach that we've taken to cybersecurity awareness. So enable your workforce. They are
Mm-hmm.
curious. They want to be helpful. Do you think they want to be the target of an attack? No, they want to
Right.
be helpful. So, like, psychologically enable them to be positive participants in the program as opposed to punishing them around the negative behavior.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was one of the people that clicked those links, and then I got reported out and called out, and I was like, oh, but it
Yeah,
did
and you
make
get
me
sent
super
to
paranoid
training.
and a lot more
Yeah,
aware.
yeah,
And
yeah. And there's room for both, but I think by way of, and I would encourage people to go look at some of Masha's presentations. She's done a great job and can articulate it way better than I can as it relates to managing human risk. Focusing solely on the negative is a huge detriment to these organizations. Like, you should be looking at and it's just the psychology of us. I think for all the achievements that we have
mhm.
in science and technology, we still understand a super, super small amount about how our brains operate. But we do have, huge bodies of literature around behavior and incentives and things of that sort. And it's true at the executive leader as well, right? Like, there's
Mhm.
famous business quotes that are like, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes, and like stuff like that. Like, we understand in other
Yeah.
elements of business the role that incentives play. So try and create those for security as well.
And now I think that's a good segue into FusionX, because I feel like you really took the red teaming approach and revolutionized the way the industry was approaching it. Can you talk us through the genesis of that?
Yeah, it really was about a frustration I had in the market where I felt like red teaming had become overly commoditized. It was like, hey, you're going to hire me. I'm going to run these tools. I'm going to give you a 600-page report. And the report had no context for the people who are trying to manage the business. And it also didn't emulate. We just spent some time talking about emulating the attacker. It didn't emulate
Mm-hmm.
the tactics, techniques, and procedures of a real attacker. And it also didn't emulate their goals. So our approach with FusionX was to solve that element of the market. We're going to come in and we're going to do realistic threat-based red teaming. And also, which was, kind of a little bit uncomfortable for a lot of organizations, we're going to operationalize the attack.
Mm.
Uh,
What
we're
do you
going to
mean
steal
by that?
money. We're going to steal money from your bank.
Oh, wow.
Uh, we're
Make it
going to
real.
access your intellectual property. Make it real. Because I'll tell you what, like, I've been in board briefings 20 years ago where I went to the board and I said, we engaged in a scan of your network and we found
Hmm.
700 low vulnerabilities, 300 medium, and 76 high. And the next quarter, the CISO goes in and, like, we did a scan of our environment and now we're down to 61 high. And you're like, that's good, right? Like, we're solving problems.
Yeah.
We're securitying, right? Like, woohoo, cheers for us. But what have you done to actually manage that catastrophic or consequential risk? How do I prioritize? How do I understand, like, where I should be applying my remediation or my controls if I've got limited time, limited budget? So with FusionX, I could walk into the board and I could say, we determine that the most likely attacker against your environment is sophisticated organized crime looking to get access to financial systems for, taking of money out of the organization. And as a result, we use the TTP of these top, Russian cybercrime threat actors. Here is the attack surface that presented itself. Here's the exploitation pathway we went through. Here's the systems that we compromised. Then we took the money out of your account and we're completely undetected. That is contextualizing for the executives the risk that they're living with. Not this, we went from 76 to 66 high level vulnerabilities. They're like, oh shit, organized crime wants to steal money from us and we don't have controls in place. And they were able to steal money. And luckily it was these guys that are going to give us the money back.
Phew.
So that's, but it's much more powerful because now I understand, like I'm solving to like the real business risk, right? Like I'm putting some meat around the bones. And we had CEOs that would challenge us, oil company. Oh, you can't get a refinery to spill oil. Guess what? You can. Oh, you can't steal money from our bank. Guess what? We can. Oh, you can't get access to our customer data. We can. That's the one area where we would put some guardrails around it, is we actually wouldn't take PII. We would get access to a system that showed that we had, we would do a screenshot that we'd black out and say like, okay, we were on the database that has all the PII. The database is 77 gigs. So we encrypted a garbage file on the server and we exfiltrated the 77 gigs. And as far as you're concerned, that was your PII because we were there, we had access to it. We were able to exfiltrate that amount of data. So your PII is gone, but we didn't want to be custodians of PII on our systems and the responsibilities associated with that. But stealing money, sure. Like that's exciting stuff. I did try and get a CISO to let me walk into a board meeting with the suitcase full of cash. Is one of my favorite movies of all times is Sneakers, which I'd highly recommend. Cybersecurity recommendations, movie recommendations, go watch Sneakers. The opening scene, they do an assessment of a bank and they do walk in to the bank with the cash, that they've stolen in the briefcase.
Boom.
And I wanted to repeat that. And the CISO told me no way.
No takers? Oh.
No. In this instance, we had actually created the money. So instead of actually taking it from somebody's account, right? Because that's also like, you can't just go take money out of a customer account because they might be trying to pay a bill and you cause them to bounce their check or their payment or whatever. So we'd have to go after like bank accounts, system accounts, like that were the actual custody of the bank. Or in this instance, we actually created money. We ledgered money that didn't exist, which you shouldn't be able to do.
Ooh.
And
can you create some money from my bank account, please?
Yeah, then we withdrew that money. And you had to withdraw it too. We had these custodial accounts, and you can imagine the legal machinations to get those in place, right? Like, because we had to account for interest, and they needed to make sure that a representative from their company could get access to the account in case I got hit by a bus. Like these custody accounts were a big deal. And when I got acquired by Accenture, they became almost impossible to manage in Accenture's legal framework. But so we'd have these accounts. They explained to me, he's like, you created money that didn't exist. That's painful. Like, right? Like from a Federal Reserve perspective, that should never happen. You moved money that doesn't exist from one bank to another. So now you've made it tangible. Like it's not just fake money in our system. It's fake money in the banking system that's moving around. He's like, if you want to convert it to cash, that's a whole new level of hurt. And we're not going there. we're gonna move this money back and disappear. But it was useful for them, right, to understand the risk. And we went completely undetected, right? So when we talked to the board, it was like, hey, $10 million, $100 million, $1 billion. What's the threshold by which this is going to be detected? Because at this point in time, we're just creating it. So we'd do the same thing, at banks and casinos and telecommunication networks. Obviously, the risk there would be getting access to equipment that would allow for accessing customer communications or engaging in DDoS types attacks, things of that sort. When we'd work with social media companies, it was access to their user data, and also they were subject to these business email compromise and those types of attacks because guess what? They operate a business, they have bank accounts. So we were multifaceted in our approach, but always grounded in one threat example. And then the other unique piece of it And for the reasons I kind of just articulated, is we convinced our customers to make it a recurring relationship. Up
Mm.
until that point in time, red teaming was like, okay, we're hiring you and you come in this year, and then next year we hire another team, and the year after that we hire another team, and like, to get multiple viewpoints, we're going to, rotate through
Sure.
these team of vendors. I'm like, okay, great. But really, like, how are you going to maintain consistency in reporting
Mm-hmm.
and understanding your environment? And really, we want the model to be is like, we are your recurring red teaming company.
Mm-hmm.
And for some entities, we did it on a quarterly basis. Sometimes it was semi-annually. But then we also could propose to them the framework by which we're engaging in the attack. So with the social network, I just gave you one example,
Mm-hmm.
access to customer data, that's a specific red team, right? Like, we would execute that as a red team. We wouldn't use that red team to go and target their bank account information. The next
Mm.
red team, we would say, okay, now we're going to pretend we're organized crime or, cyber criminals, and we're going to try and access your bank information. So we would create these compartments that made the problem more manageable as well, because you could look at it the same way you'd look at it from like a MITRE attack type framework, or like, what are the threat actors? What are they trying to accomplish? And then
Mm-hmm.
what are the controls that they're going to try and circumvent to achieve that goal? So I think by being able to tailor it, and there were some companies where we worked through, the most we ever did is 12 in a year for a really big bank. And it just happened that they had these 12 different business departments, and we were just rotating through.
Mm-hmm.
The scenarios were different for each business department, right? Like, how consumer banking is viewed, vice your client advisory for financial investment, vice your mortgage unit. Like, these are all kind of unique businesses. So we would treat them as unique, because what an attacker is trying to accomplish in targeting each of those business lines is different from each other. So it was unique. And then I built just an incredible culture that allowed me to attract and retain the top white hat hackers in the world and keep them challenged and fulfilled and come to work as themselves. Because I think in this environment, they suffered from a lot of, it's not a good culture fit. You want me to dress a certain
Mm-hmm.
way. You want me to keep certain hours. I have, unique needs around how I need to work and interact with folks. I'm really comfortable talking to customers, or I don't like talking to customers. We built an environment where like all of that could mesh together. Um, and we're uber supportive of everyone. We had independent development goals. We did challenges internally. We gave them really hard problems, like stealing money from a bank is like a super hard, super fun problem. We would let them create their own challenges. Our CTO Tom had the CTO challenge every quarter, where a part of your bonus was based on you identifying a problem. It didn't have to be something that was a direct benefit to the business. If it was great. And then you went through the process, with time that we paid you for,
Mm-hmm.
of figuring out how you're going to solve that problem and the solution to it. And then we would get together once a quarter and people would brief what they did, and we'd have pizza. But it gave people that, like, okay, I'm intellectually stimulated by this adjacency, but it
Yeah.
doesn't directly contribute to my business. And we wanted people to have that ability to be stimulated or have these externalities that they could explore. And it can't be your full-time job, but we could carve off time and incentives associated with that. And then I took just really good care of my employees, right? Like, I had an open door policy. I was 100% transparent in how I spent my time. Every single employee in the company could see my calendar, to
Mm-hmm.
include when I was going to a hockey game or it was my dad's birthday. Like, I did
Mm.
not run a personal or work calendar. I ran one calendar, and everything went in there. So I was accountable to my employees as to how I was spending my time as well. And then made business decisions that were expensive, but the right thing. The one that's easiest to articulate is, I found the best PPO healthcare plan that I could find in the market. And then I
Mm-hmm.
covered 100% of the costs for the employees, including families.
Wow.
And I had an employee that actually came up, or two times this came up with employees. One was, it was a single employee who was like, hey, the company's only paying $600 a year for healthcare for me, but they're paying $2,800 for my peer because he has a family. I was just like, if you have a family, we'll pay for your family as well. But like, don't view it as a $2,000 differential in the benefits
Right.
here. View it as like, we're taking care of the whole system, right?
Yes.
And there's going to be the unit is healthcare. It's not
Yes.
dollars. And like the best analogy today that didn't exist at the time is the John Wick movie series. I don't know if you ever have watched that, but in the John Wick world that they've created, you have this concept of gold coins, and the gold coin will buy you a drink at the bar. It'll buy you a night at the hotel. It'll buy you a person who'll clean up the body you just killed. It's like this universal store of value where it's like, it is. So it's like, just think of it as like healthcare is healthcare, right? Like we're
Yeah.
providing healthcare indifferent of the cost. Then another employee that came up and said, hey, like I've never had an employer that is paid 100% of the premium on a plan like this. Like, how do
That's
you
wild.
justify it? They were like
Yeah.
genuinely curious. Like, how do you justify it? I said, well, let me explain to you, like, it's two unique elements of it. One is a very generous element, and that I want to take care of my employees, and that's the original grounding in this decision. The second element is it's selfish. I get more productivity out of you if you don't have to worry about healthcare. If your kid has an earache,
Yeah.
and you've got to go to the GP, and the GP needs to give you a referral to the specialist, then you go to the specialist, then you get to the pharmacy, and the medicine that they dialed in is not covered, and then you got to go back to the doctor and get something else covered through. I'm like, you're stressed, you're distracted, you're wasting time, your child is not getting the care that they need. Those are all negative to me in the business. I want you to be focused and not distracted, and know that, like, go straight to the specialist, get the ear checked out, go to the pharmacy, get exactly the drug that you need, get your kid back on the path to health. And guess what? Now you're back working. So for me to pay that healthcare price, to remove that distraction, to remove that stress, to make sure that your family is being taken care of, is generous and selfish at the same time. Like, it's got those two dichotomies to it.
Oh, it's huge. And as a Canadian coming from free healthcare to the US, where my son went through brain surgery, and I was fortunate to have a very great healthcare plan, it's worth its weight in gold. And so
Yes, yeah,
I would come work for you in a heartbeat just on that alone.
Yeah. No, healthcare in the U.S. is atrocious right now. It's a huge problem that I hope that we will solve. So, and I didn't realize that you're Canadian. Where from Canada?
Yeah, I grew up in BC.
Okay, nice.
But
Cool. Beautiful.
now I have 2 half American babies, so this is home.
Yeah. YouTube thinks I should live in BC because it constantly gives me all these houses available for me, like Kelowna and Vancouver, and like all these beautiful locations.
Oh,
God, so beautiful.
It is beautiful. Yep. But now I get the best of both because I can go visit. Well, and then, so you sold FusionX to Accenture. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah. So selling FusionX to Accenture, interestingly enough, we weren't trying to sell the company. I know it sounds, I wasn't at the stage where we were looking to sell the company. But as a repeat entrepreneur, I knew the mistakes I had made in the businesses previously. And part of that was having kind of the advisor to me on what I was building. Now, I also feel with FusionX, I knew how to engineer a really good business, right? I knew how businesses were valued. I knew what customers valued. I knew what employees valued. I knew the culture I wanted to build. So and I'm still young enough that, I take multiple swings here probably in the future as well. But, I knew what I wanted to build, right? So like from an architecture perspective, I had built the bridges that like didn't carry the load weight that they wanted. I built the bridge that, maybe I thought was worth $5 million. It was only worth $3 million. Like I had learned from my own mistakes and the mistakes of other entrepreneurs that I worked with. And I'd also seen the best in people and companies. So it was super well engineered company. Right. And I knew that I would sell it someday. I always joke with entrepreneurs and they tell me like, oh, I'm not in it for the money. I don't want to sell. I'm like, bullshit. That's not true. Like nobody gets
the price tag just isn't high enough.
I'm building a lifestyle company, right? Like the journey of entrepreneurship is to build something that other people value. And the only feedback loop that we have for how things are valued is to like IPO or sell it, right?
Yeah.
So there are exceptions, but obviously I think any entrepreneur that comes to me and says like, oh, I'm not building this to sell. I'm like, okay, first off, let's just be honest with each other because we've got to start this conversation on the right foot. You're building to sell. So if we know the end state, let's engineer what we're building to help accomplish that. It doesn't need to be the full weighting of the decisions you make, but it needs to be that background factor. So anyway, FusionX, as a result of those mistakes I'd made in the past, one thing I decided to do was I engaged an investment banker a couple years into building the business, where I said, like, hey, I'm not ready to sell, but if you're willing to have the relationship with me, I've got a great viewpoint on the market, so I can give you free advice. But I also want to ask you questions. I'm thinking about making an investment. I think it would be viewed this way in the market. How would it be viewed? And so I found a really great partner to work with in Boston Meridian, and JC Rabi and others there at that firm. And so we had dinners and we had phone calls and like weren't trying to sell the company. But one thing that they would do is when we would go to big events like RSA and Black Hat, they would say to people in their ecosystem, they'd say, hey, you should meet this company. They're doing really cool stuff. They got a really great team. Their customers love them. They're not for sale, but like, 3, 4, 5 years, they will be. So you should get to know them now and establish the trust and, the relationship, and then you can track and, keep in contact with them. So that's what we would do. We would, each event I might have 3 or 4 meetings that fell into that category where they set it up and they're just like, hey, you should meet these folks. So one of the meetings at RSA that year was with Accenture. And we had a great conversation. We told them about our business. Accenture found it fascinating because they had tried to build FusionX and they had failed. So they saw in us. And then Accenture also found it fascinating because we were a small company, but we were in these big accounts, 8 of the top 10 banks in the US, the big social media, the big telecommunication, and they're in those accounts. And they kept hearing about us. It was this element of these FusionX guys are doing something cool because their boards are talking about them and their executives are talking about them and their CISOs are telling us that it's like the most valuable dollar they spend every year is on the FusionX team. That was like a direct quote from a CISO to an Accenture person. It's like, we want to know who they are. And so we did. And then back in DC, like a month later, the head of the security practice came and met with me directly. And he's like, hey, I'm going to be frank. Like, I feel like you guys aren't for sale, but we're at this inflection point with Accenture where the magic time to bring a company like yours in is now. Like 3 years from now, like we're probably still interested, but by way of disproportionate impact that you can have on Accenture, the time is now. And so we're like, okay, make us an offer. And as you mentioned, like everybody's got their price. They had a really good price. And I sat down, a team on my end, and I was like, okay, like we could build for another 3 or 5 years, and based on market dynamics, we could wind up with the same exact offer. So given that we like what they're trying to build, we like the respect that they have for our team, their messaging was super important. They respected the culture that we had built. They loved the work that we were doing. As I mentioned, they tried and had failed at doing it. And the thing that won me over was they looked me in the eye and they said, look, our goal is not to acquire FusionX and make FusionX look like Accenture. Our goal is to acquire FusionX and make Accenture look like FusionX. And for me, I was just like, okay, that's an interesting element. Like nobody comes in and says like, we're not going to assimilate you into the Borg. We're trying to inject you as a virus, and we hope you take over the host system, right? So for me, that was kind of a unique challenge. Like, oh, okay, like what would the FusionXification of Accenture's security practice look like?
Because at the time, they were 5,000 professionals, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't remember the exact number, but it was a lot, right? And also protective of our culture, right? Like creating these firewalls to make sure that, they didn't annoy us with procedures, and they let us hire this really great EA. Tom Parker, co-founder, and I were like overburdened with trying to understand Accenture, and they had this like shared EA pool, and we're like, it's just not working for us. Like we need a dedicated person, at least for the first couple of years. And they sent somebody in, that said like, oh, tell us what you're looking for and this and that. Like we need somebody who understands Accenture backend systems and all the shortcuts and like what our roles are as managing directors. And I remember them saying like, oh, I have someone, she was the EA to the president of North America for 17 years and he just retired. And she said, and neither one of them would mind that I say this. She said, but she's a little bit weird. I was like, okay, what does weird mean? She's like, well, She's in her 60s and she wears a mohawk and has tattoos. And Tom and I looked at each other and we looked back at her and we
Perfect.
said, we'll take her. And she's like, what? You haven't even met her. I'm like, no, for my merry band of hackers, this is exactly the den mother that we need. And she
The
was
den mother.
phenomenal and is still like the role that she played in the team and like taking care of us as we integrated into this company and helping Tom and I navigate it was just, brilliant. So, as any investment banker does, they made us go through a little bit of a process. They, had other companies that were interested in us that we just hadn't taken seriously. And they reached out and said, hey, these guys are coming on the market. Do you want to make a bid? And we got a bunch of different bids and some were low, some were higher, but Accenture was the right fit, right? Like we definitely was like kind of our Goldilocks element for a lot of reasons. The complexity of the deal that they proposed was really minimal. The roles we were going to play was really substantial, the respect for our team. But then for me, it was this disproportionality. And that's a key element of how I determine where to spend my time is I'm looking for disproportional impact. Coming on a podcast like that, like you and I are having a great conversation, but I'm relying on the fact that we're going to educate a much wider audience. And then the people that watch this are going to share it with somebody in their workforce or around a dinner table. And you just have this amplification. So I'm always looking for opportunities for amplification, which is why I still teach and why I still mentor and why, say yes to come on podcasts and do this. So I viewed it as this like opportunity for us to have a disproportionate impact. And it was a great mashup, great team there, great culture. We were able to do great things. So I have zero regrets about selling FusionX to Accenture.
So it's so funny because I used to be a really big fan of Criminal Minds. And so Penelope Garcia is kind of the persona I have in mind when I think of a hacker. And so when you tell me, about FusionX and how everybody embraced their individuality, I just think of, that many Penelope Garcias, and then you explode that to 5,000 and what it was like to manage, such a dynamic workforce. So what is reality versus, my envision?
Yeah. So reality was like, first off, like hats off to Accenture. Cause I mean, I'm at best like a small company entrepreneur, right? I've never built something to IPO level, never had thousands of employees. So for them to empower us to have an impact on that practice and make me the global managing director for their cyber defense practice there's a pretty big risk to take. Right. So when I went into that position, my biggest fear was, oh my gosh, like all these things I worry about as an entrepreneur around like the, chargeable hours and projects and hiring, like that is now amplified to an unmanageable level. But guess what? I found out there's a whole infrastructure that just kind of like magically took care of that for me. Right. So it's like after I got through that kind of like, deep breathing exercise, like, oh my gosh, how am I going to manage this? And then what I found was really that, in the practice, there was a spirit of entrepreneurship. There were people that wanted to grow. There were people that wanted to innovate. There were people that wanted to collaborate. And all I needed to do was structure and empower that, find those people and promote them and empower them. And then the other big element of it, right? So that was like the people internal piece. I recognized a gap that we had in the market. I went and acquired iDefense, which Accenture let me do. And that was a great add to our team because I didn't have threat intelligence internally. We built a global fusion center that put us, the FusionX team with iDefense with Accenture labs. Because guess what? Accenture had this great labs capability and they were like stuck in the corner of a corporate office. And then you put them in with our group of hackers and cyber people. And it was just great collaboration and the water cooler conversation, happening in that environment.
The
And then
Carpet Club.
and then the other part was the message to market. And I think that's also where I was able to have an impact because we changed it completely from being this like FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt, attackers are coming to what does responsible security management look like, right? Like how do you, these things we've talked about, how do you right size a program? How do you decide what investments to make, right? Like that you don't have an infinite budget. Like we actually went to market and said, we know, I would go to a CISO and be like, I know you got to reduce your security spend. You just have to, right? It's not sustainable. I'm sure you're getting pressure from the board. There's like no pre-brief from them. I would just, because I just knew the market, I would say like this is just it can't continue like this. So let's work together on figuring out what you should prioritize, what you're getting value from, what you're not getting value from, right? Like where you should be making your investments. So we really made it about this security transformation journey
Mm-hmm.
that really resonated in the market. So, timing that message and being empowered to shift the messaging, right, across an entire corporation was also meaningful in that regard. So it was a fun journey. Again, I'm super appreciative, and we were impactful. Like we went and did great things and saw tremendous growth.
And gosh, I bet your leadership style changed quite a bit going from a smaller firm to leading a
It
global
it
practice.
it did, yes. I had to get used to this. Like your time becomes like super managed. My days were completely filled. There was expectations of like, you got to meet with all these. I had like 14 different practice areas. Yeah. You have customers. I would show up at RSA and I would joke that it was a choose my own adventure, because I would look at my calendar and I would have 3 things booked every hour. And I would have to say like, okay, which meeting am I going to show up at and which 2 am I not going to show up at? And a lot of times that was dictated by just like distance. Like it'll take me 20 minutes to get to this one. It'll take me 5 to get this one. I'm going to the one 5 minutes away because I can have a more meaningful conversation. Right. So definitely there was an overwhelming aspect to it,
Mm-hmm.
around management. I had to update my attire. That was one thing that my wife was insisting on as well. She's like, you got to embrace the Accenture part a little
She
bit.
saw that as a
And
positive.
and now I've regressed, I'm back to the black t-shirts, but so I protected the employees, and the dress code and the culture, but I myself had to acclimate a little bit to the environment that I was in. But it was a great learning experience, and I met so many incredible people, and we did these great things that, it's
Yeah.
the big companies are hard, but they're also, wonderful things as well, because they are just so impactful, right? The scale we
Mm-hmm.
can get is just kind of crazy across these big companies.
I was going to say, like it sounded like with FusionX, you had access to a lot of big companies, but when you go to an Accenture, it's just you have a badge to walk so many more halls. And so, how did you
Yes.
see the benefit of that?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, I had a lot of CISO conversations, obviously, a lot of board conversations. I mean, so that was great. Uh, I had to shift the expectation of my team that was kind of market facing to make sure that
Mm-hmm.
they understood that my style was not to walk in and sell, that my style was to walk in and have a conversation and establish trust and rapport, and that it would drive people crazy. Actually, during the acquisition, Accenture was asking for our FusionX deck. What do you send to clients? What do you pitch? And I said, it doesn't exist. I said, I don't allow my team to use decks because it should be a conversation. If I'm cycling through slides, I'm missing the cues about the feedback you're trying to provide me. I'm missing the opportunity to hear what's important to you and what's keeping you up at night, right? It's like, and the ability to adapt based on what you're hearing is a much more effective tool to establish trust and lead to that
Mm-hmm.
sale than stepping through bullet points where you've structured the conversation. You've structured it from your perspective, where the client is, should be more than 50% of the conversation. So getting them to adapt to that style where they would want me to come in and do a pitch deck, et cetera. And Accenture was so distressed by the fact we didn't have a deck because it was such a common thing, that I found out after the acquisition that somebody on their team actually created one on our behalf, and that they were circulating that internally just because they like couldn't fathom, having a conversation around acquiring this company without sharing the deck, right? Um, so I had to adapt folks to kind of to that style of this were going to be conversations. This was not going to be a pushy sale. I also
Yeah.
had to adapt my teams towards collaboration because, the team
Yeah.
I inherited was a bit stovepiped. People would go and have a conversation around cloud security and not talk about infrastructure security, or not talk about the security transformation or red teaming. I was like, look, it needs to be a holistic practice. I don't want you
Mm-hmm.
pushing everything, but you need to listen to the customer and understand the cue points where we can be a broader part of the conversation than just your silo of services that you're responsible for. And that opened up, a lot of collaboration internally within the company as well. And also the ability to promote the performers, like seeing the people that adopted that collaboration, that were
Mm-hmm.
trying to be innovative, that established the trust in the customers, and being like, okay, like, I'm going to give you more responsibility.
Yeah. And now working in an organization that big with such a deep bench, I mean, you get to pick kind of your top talent and pick and choose from such a wider pool of capabilities. So now if you were giving advice to a CISO on how to build a high performing team, what would you tell them?
That's a great question. I think there's multiple elements of that, right? Like I love the curiosity
Mm-hmm.
aspect. Like if people are genuinely curious around the problems that you're trying to solve in the business from a cybersecurity perspective, I think that's huge. Uh, I'm a big fan of team diversity by
Mm-hmm.
way of viewpoints and across the spectrum diversity. I feel like build stronger teams. Uh, I'm a big fan of providing opportunities for dissent. I'm a red teamer, right? Like I loved in the movie World War Z with Brad Pitt. I don't know if you've
It's a
seen
good
that.
one.
It's a
Yeah.
zombie movie. Um, when they get to Israel and Israel's already built the wall, and he asks him like, hey, how did you guys get the insight to build the wall? And I said, well, we have this 10th man rule.
Mm-hmm.
If 9 of us agree, the 10th is obligated to disagree, to take the contrarian point. So I'm also a big fan of like contrarian viewpoints, and like, let's not have groupthink, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's embrace the fact that people can have an alternative perspective on this, or an alternative pathway, and let's not dismiss it, right? So I love that they introduced that, because I did that by nature, and now I had a name for it. Like it wasn't red teaming; it was the kind of the 10th person principle of that obligated dissent. So I think that's important. I think empowering your employees to professionally develop, like not
Mm-hmm.
diminishing the role that training plays. And this is there's a lot of changes, there's a lot of new innovation, there's just a lot of capability that gets built in here, and you have to be empowering your employees to take advantage of learning those new capabilities, or learning those new elements of the market, or pursuing that interest of theirs. Maybe they're a SOC team member and they want to be a red teamer, and you look at your training budget like, no, you're only allowed to do SOC training. It's like,
Right.
no, let's they get value, even if they never become a red teamer, they get value working in the SOC if they understand red teaming. So why
Mm-hmm.
is that not a valid training opportunity for a person like that? It can't be the only thing, but you can't start to exclude that. Um, so I think if you start to combine those things, the trust, the collaboration, the
Mm-hmm.
viewing security in the organization as like a tool that is valuable, and not something that's like pass fail. We would have that with red teaming as well. I would
Mm-hmm.
always tell the executives, like, I win every time, right? Like, you're sending your team out to play against the undefeated team that has never lost. Why would you go and criticize them for losing? Why don't we look at ways that we can make them better, or empower them to win, or make the game a little closer, right? Like, stop viewing this as a test that you pass or fail, and
Yeah.
view it as a tool that you have in your arsenal to improve the security posture of your organization. Because that's what I am. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
tool. Our red team is a tool by which you can make better security decisions, by which you can make configuration changes, by which you can educate and articulate the value of security to your leadership and to your board, right? So don't view it as like a pass fail. And I think in organizations, you got to foster that as well. Like, how can we make bad news an opportunity to learn from and make ourselves better?
So my takeaway is you have a very heavy emphasis on the soft side and the softer skills than the technical skills.
Yeah, for sure. Like some of the best technical folks I've ever met don't have formal degrees or training or
Mm-hmm.
certifications, right? So like they have that genuine curiosity. I have, when I would interview people, I have what I call the home lab test, and I still do it. Actually, I don't know if I should reveal this, with my veteran scholarship program. If you put in there, they're like, you built a home lab and you did this and you did that. I'm like, oh, there's genuine curiosity that I can work with, because you're using your free time
Right.
to learn and do something, right, that has value from my perspective in the role that you can play. So that element of it, I think, is super important. And the diverse experience aspect of it too, right? I really learned that when I was at the Terrorism Research Center,
Mm-hmm.
where one of the things that we ran at the Terrorism Research Center was this global fusion center. It was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, collecting, synthesizing, producing intelligence for our customers. But it was in the global fusion center, we didn't have a classified programs element. In our other divisions, we had classified programs elements. So the people that worked at Global Fusion Center didn't have to have clearances. And guess what? That meant that I could hire the people that the CIA wouldn't hire.
Right.
Because they were
You could hire the
first-generation
Canadians.
Americans, the Canadians. Yeah. I could go and like build what was like, oh, great. Like, we're looking at unrest in Egypt. I've got the woman who's like first generation, American, who still has family there, who understands the culture and the
Yeah.
language and can actually reach back and like ask questions, like what's happening on the street. Like that's invaluable. And she could never get hired into the CIA just based on these, kind of artificial gates. So I was able to go take advantage of that and be like, okay, like who can you not hire? Like that's good for me because I can bring those people in and they're hugely valuable components of that fusion center.
Oh, that's great. And then, my other key takeaway from you is just kind of critical thinking is key. And I think that's a good segue into OODA because at its essence, it's really a decision-making framework, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, the company name is an homage to the OODA loop, which, if you're not familiar with, stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. And we didn't come up with it. An Air Force colonel did. It was an Air Force colonel who was undefeated in dogfighting, including at the Top Gun, right? We're all familiar with Top Gun, where we fight against each other. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, not only was he not defeated, he was able to defeat people in a super small amount of time. I think it's like 40 seconds or something like that. Whereas like he could start from a position of disadvantage and he could reverse it and win the dogfight. And like, I think it was 40 seconds. Don't 30, 40 seconds, somewhere in there. This attracted the attention, as you can imagine, of the Department of Defense leadership to like, who is this guy and what differentiates him, right? It's like when you have an overperforming athlete, you're kind of trying to figure out like what makes them tick. So he gets pulled back into Washington, D.C. and like, what makes you tick? And he basically articulated at its simplest concept that he goes through this decision loop: observe, orient, decide, act. And that he does it on an iterative cycle and that he does it faster than his adversary. And that's what differentiates him as he goes through this decision cycle: observe, orient, decide, act, observe, orient, decide, act. And it's like, able to do this. And that became a great framework for thinking about defense, but it turns out it's a great framework for thinking about business. It's a great framework for thinking about cyber risk. It's a great framework for thinking about a lot of things. So early in my career at the Pentagon, I got exposed to John Boyd's OODA loop. And we would have little conferences and we'd have little meetups. And, it was literally called the Disciples of Boyd. Got to meet his family. And years ago, the domains came up for sale. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to buy these. And someday I'm going to use them. And so in forming OODA, where our focus was on how do we empower decision making, right? How do we get people the right things, the right observations, like
Mm-hmm.
give them the right pieces of information. And that could be what's happening geopolitically, what is cyber risk, but even more so, it's about like, what is quantum computing? What is artificial intelligence? What are these disruptive technologies? What impact will they have? And how should you be thinking about them? And give it to them in a very objective manner where like, we're not trying to sell them a technology. We're just trying to get them to understand it. And we're trying to get them to make better decisions and then action those decisions, right? So our tagline is enabling intelligent action, right? Like we want people to be able to take action from what we're giving them. So it turns out that OODA is just a great homage, right, from a company naming perspective, for a firm that focuses on that type of stuff, right, that is able to provide those types of advisory services. We run something called the OODA Network,
Mm-hmm.
which is 300 professionals. They're executives, CEOs, CTOs, CISOs, subject matter experts, former government executives that all share a common passion for knowing more about the world to make better decisions. And the membership, we actually don't make any money off it. The membership fees fund an independent research team that produces the content. And then once a year, we get together for a big conference. We do events at RSA and Black Hat. We do dinners. We do meetups at my startup studio on like quantum computing and blockchain and cybersecurity, and kind of foster that element of it. So OODA is kind of a unique consulting and advisory firm, and that we play a lot of different roles, from advising boards of directors on managing their cyber risk, to helping cybersecurity companies grow in the market, to managing this professional network that has these associated events and kind of things associated with it. And the one last thing I will say is, like, we don't own the term OODA. We don't have a trademark on it. John Boyd came up with it while he was in the employ of the Department of Defense. And when we decided to use it, I actually had gotten to know his daughter over the years, and I reached out to the family and said, I want to do this, but I'm only going to do it with your blessing. And they gave me their blessing. They're like, oh, what a great homage. Like, we'll send you some of my dad's stuff to hang in the office. Yeah. So it was just kind of a magic fit. And then, of course, we give away his biography and tell his story. Right?
Yeah.
The thing about the amplification that he has. He's been deceased now for a number of years, but he still lives on in everything that we do.
Oh my goodness. Like, so many things about you. Every time I thought I knew, about OODA Loop, and then, there's all that, so much more. So can you
like to be super eclectic and diverse in the things that I focus on. And I think that's a luxury that I have, given my success, is that I can choose where I want to spend my time and where I think I can be most useful.
Yeah. And so how should companies reach out to you? And can you give an example of where a company's hired OODA to deploy its methodologies, and then a success story that came out of that?
Yeah, I mean, we typically get brought in on an advisory / consulting basis in a couple of unique ways. One is that it's an organization that's trying to manage some sort of complex risk or some sort of complex technology, where we can come in and help them think through the risk that they're managing. It's, again, that HackThink approach, right? Like, let's dissect the problem. Let's look at the component parts. Let's figure out the strategy on an ongoing basis. What sort of information do you need to continue to update your decision cycle? Like, how do we guide them through making those decisions? Sometimes that's confronting the hard truth. I'm a big fan of this concept of gray rhinos, which was a idea articulated by this author, Michelle Wucker. So we're familiar with the concept of black swans, right? It was like unanticipated events. How could we ever predict it? How can you manage towards something that you can't predict? It's like, okay, great. Black swans exist. They're going to have their impact. But she articulated this proposition of the gray rhino. A rhinoceros is an incredibly dangerous animal. And if you're staring at the rhino, it probably means that there's some risk that you're facing that is super obvious. It's this big, huge rhino. So the gray rhino is meant to exemplify the risk that you know about, that you're staring in the face, but that you refuse to acknowledge and take action around. And so we try and force people into this function of, like, you have to take action. There are things that you can do. You have to recognize the gray rhino. And I interviewed Michelle on my podcast, and it's super fascinating. And I use that analogy all the time. I'm like, let's confront the gray rhinos. Quantum computing is a gray rhino. I can't tell you whether it's going to happen in 2 years or 10 years, but I can tell you it's going to happen, and it's going to be impactful on your business. And there's decisions you can make now that are low friction that can allow you to address that risk, rather than be surprised by it. If all of a sudden tomorrow China turns on a quantum computer and they can decrypt all of your stuff, right? Like, let's think through those issues a little bit more contextually. So that's an example, right? Where, like, a company is having a hard time operating in a geopolitically challenging environment. A company is facing a technology risk. They might be facing an innovation risk where they can't figure out how to continue to innovate inside their environment, or the executive team is just trying to get that fiduciary kind of perspective on what they're trying to do. So we do that element of it. And then the other element on the advisory side kind of shifts it, and it says, okay, you're a company that has a really innovative solution, that has a really innovative service. How do you build a company to service the market? Like, how do you develop your go-to-market strategy?
Mm-hmm.
How do you build your team? How do you make sure that you are continually developing your capabilities? So we do advisory work where I'm able to be entrepreneurial, but not be the entrepreneur,
Yeah.
uh, and assist the entrepreneurs on this journey through that shared experience and the expertise that we have. So we do that with about it's probably like 15 companies that we work with in that role, ranging from small companies with 10 people to
Yeah.
publicly traded companies who realize like they need that kind of injection of perspective and that hack think kind of methodology. Um, so those are examples, right? Where like, companies trying to navigate a risk in a particular environment will come help them, or a company's trying to figure out how to go to market. And then the other element that's outside of OODA is that I operate this startup studio in Reston, Virginia, that I call the Hack Factory, where again, I'm working with entrepreneurs, but not only is it existing entrepreneurs, but we actually, the studio element, I'll have people come that say like, I really want to build a company and I really want to build it in this space. And because I'm drawn to it, I think there's something that can be done there. And we will actually go to the whiteboard and we will create the company from scratch. We will ideate what should exist in the market that doesn't, what problems would it solve, what does the market opportunity look like, what technology we would need to build, what team would we need to build, and then we start doing it. And we do it in-house. And so the advantage of that is that by the time you're going to raise venture capital funds or trying to grow the company, instead of just being a person with a PowerPoint deck and an idea, you have something tangible. You've built a product, you've built the technology, you've built the team. In one that we've got that's launching in August, they've got the revenue already, like customers already buying what we've built. So that's a super fun process, right? Because I'm a big fan of just sitting at the whiteboards, and that wasn't something that was unique to me. I didn't come up with the idea. I actually participated in a friendly manner in Max Levchkin's startup studio in San Francisco in like 2009, 2010. And it was like the most fascinating conversations I ever had. And you would see these like huge value get built out of these conversations. And I wanted to replicate that in the DC area and for entrepreneurs in this space. So I got two companies launching out of that in the next 4 to 6 weeks. So it's going to be exciting.
That's incredible. I'm so excited to hear how those go.
Yeah.
And so, what would you ultimately like to look back and have your legacy be?
Uh, I love that the disproportionate impact, right? Like I want to be viewed as somebody that had utility.
Yeah.
I did this interview for my old college magazine, right? I graduated 30 years ago from undergraduate, and the alumni magazine in the small college reached out and they're like, hey, we'd love to do a profile of you. And they've done a couple of me over the years at various times. And so I was like, okay, sure. I can be inspirational to students and like share my experience because I have this super humble upbringing of, being educated in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Vermont and, going and becoming an entrepreneur. And I didn't intend to say this, but I felt like the interviewer in this interview captured this great quote from me. And they said, well, kind of what was the core ethos of your journey as an entrepreneur? And I said, I saw how the world was changing and I put myself in a position to be useful. To me, that's like the core. I want people to look back and say like, okay, he saw how things were changing and he didn't just write about the world is changing. He didn't just observe the world was changing, that he actually put himself in a position to be useful in how the world was changing in a positive manner. So for me, I think that's the metric by which I will judge my life, my career, kind of the impact that I've had. And then couple that with the disproportionality. Uh, I taught at Georgetown for 14 years, 28 consecutive semesters, 600 students. It was a lot. And that distracted from my family. And it was, every Monday night. And I loved doing it. I loved working with the students. I loved the curiosity. I loved educating them because the class started in 2002. So you can imagine like cybersecurity wasn't front of
Yeah.
mind for all of these students. So now, removed from that experience by a decade, I have better visibility into the impact that I had. And it makes me view that the teaching was rewarding, but it's even more rewarding when you realize like you inspired people to be entrepreneurs. You inspired people to get into cybersecurity. They went out and did these incredible things. And I love that my students maintain this touch point where they send me the letters, they introduce themselves to me at conferences, they reach out to me on LinkedIn. Like I love that feedback loop of just like how impactful I was. So now I've made like, okay, I'm always going to be a teacher. I'm always going to be teaching somewhere, because I just love the fact that I can go and share my knowledge, my experience. I can empower the students to take their unique spin on these topics, and that not for everybody, but with a decent number of people, you have that impact. And that impact is also exponential because they go out and they have an impact. And then the people that they have an impact on have an impact. And I'm a big fan of exponentials. So anytime I can put myself in a position to have an exponential impact, I kind of try and jump on it.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, you've clearly had such a big impact on a lot of people. So what advice would you have? You've obviously built a lot of great habits, successes, somebody following in your footsteps.
Yeah, I think, I would advise people to be curious and passionate. And I think there's a hard work element to that, right? To execute on vision, to execute on dreams and aspirations, right? I think like it's the coupling of all of these things that become super, super valuable over the long term. So whenever I have advice, I'm always like, hey, like what makes you excited, right? There's that great quote. I share it on Instagram every now and then, right? Like to go find things that you're, that light a fire in you, because what the world needs is more people that have the fire lit. Like I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but I believe that is to be true, right? Like you got to find that element of it. So I think it's about finding that balance, taking risks. I definitely have been a risk taker throughout my career. I think that's important. Following your gut, following your intuition. I have entrepreneurs that come to me with like a side hustle, and they'll be like, hey, I've got this idea, I've built this little company. When do I quit my job and make it my full-time thing? And I tell them, if you have to ask me that question, then it's not now. Like you should be feeling it. Like it should be so, like the fire should be there so much that like you're jumping at the opportunity to try and take that risk and go out and do something, right? And I get that people have family dynamics, et cetera, but like you have to feel it, and then you have to act on it. So I think for me, I was super passionate about how I saw things were changing: cybersecurity, counter-terrorism, technology innovation, entrepreneurship. And I like went and said, like, I can be most useful here. I didn't go and try and create CrowdStrike. I'm not suited to building that type of company. I built the types of company that where I could have an impact, or I could have the most value, or I could provide the most utility. So I think there's, and I'm rambling a little bit, but there's like a humbling aspect of that as well, to like, you don't have to be a billionaire. You don't have to be, the best at something. You don't have to exactly emulate somebody else's experiences. You have to create the experience that you want to get.
One final question, I promise. I'm curious, a few weeks back on your Global Frequency Sunday newsletter, you said, increasingly, I get the sense that I'm living in a science fiction novel. So I was wondering what science fiction novel came to mind when you wrote that, and why?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think there's multiple right now that I feel like I'm in. One is I feel, cyberpunk science fiction, right? Like the dystopian element of technology. We're getting right now without the cool neon lit landscape and robotic arms. The cyberpunk genre always appealed to me because it was almost kind of like a negative portrait of the route that technology could play, right? If you look at it as like the disintegration of society, and you have all this cool tech, and it's kind of cool to live in the Blade Runner world, but it's super sad and depressing. And I actually wrote an essay I haven't published yet when I was up at my house in Vermont, called Cyberpunk Lost, where I feel like we're getting some of those negative consequences of technology with how we're being manipulated, how others have control over our data, but without the science fiction aesthetic. So that's one element where I do definitely feel like we need to shift the power variable around the technology being able to provide benefit to us, right? Like we talked about healthcare and things of that sort. Like there's technology can solve a lot of problems. We need to take ownership of our own data and be empowered to use this technology to our own benefits, not just to the benefit of corporations, an entrepreneur. So, and I feel like I'm living in a science fiction world. That's one element of it. The other element is like a whole other podcast around the dysfunction of governance right now. We certainly are in that same element in a hugely dysfunctional state. And if people want to understand my perspective on that a little bit closer, I would encourage them to go to the OODAloop.com and read the OODA Almanac. So the OODA Almanac is like my equivalent of the Farmer's Almanac that my grandfather read every year. It's not meant to be perfect, but it's meant to like kind of slap you in the face with these ideas that I think are real opportunities and real risks. And it's where I allow myself to be kind of the edgiest that I ever am with regards to the language that I use and the concepts that I provide. And I think there's a whole element there around dysfunction of governance that we need to address as well, which is interesting and impactful. And then the third area, and I know you asked one simple question, but you're getting three responses.
No, I love it.
So the first answer is kind of like Neuromancer with William Gibson. The second answer is maybe, a little bit of Snow Crash, with Neil Stephenson. And then the third, the most impactful book that I've read over the past couple of years is called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it deals primarily with climate change and this concept of we live a lot in the here and now, and we talk about that today with like establishing legacy, and we make a lot of decisions that are in our selfish best interest, but without thought for the consequence of subsequent generations. And in the Ministry for the Future, the UN actually establishes a ministry that it represents the unborn, where they get a voice at the table over the decisions that are being made. There's a whole subtext there around like the impact of climate change and kind of the mass casualty and the like changing of behavior. But I also feel like we need to have this viewpoint of our time is not just now. We need to move beyond the selfishness. I think Scott Galloway's TED Talk is probably one of the most impactful talks I've seen. I also linked to that in my newsletter probably a month ago. And I think it's entitled, Do We Love Our Children? Or that's the core piece of it, right? Like we're making decisions now, we're transferring wealth now, we're creating future debt environments now, we're impacting the environment now in ways for which there will be no consequences for us, but there will be huge consequences for subsequent generations. So when I say something like that, where I say I feel like I'm living in a science fiction novel, it's a little bit of a complicated answer because it's touching upon multiple pieces of it. That said, the thing I will close with, there's lots of positive elements as well, right? Like we have this extremely disruptive technologies that we've built that can have huge benefit to society if we harness them correctly. And they're exponential. AI is exponential, and people look at it and they're like, oh, AI started with ChatGPT. No, a computer beat the world champion chess player 25 years ago. So the analogy I use, and and you'll see this as a theme in my newsletter as well, we can't comprehend exponentials. We just can't, right? It's super hard for us to understand. Something's going to double next year, then it's going to double again. I mean, just imagine if you like doubled your weight every year, we'd be exploding out of our houses in the next 5 years. Right? It's this crazy factoring thing. So there's this great analogy around the invention of chess that's a fable, which I don't know if you've heard, where the king is bored and it calls on the community to say, like, come and invent a new game. And this peasant invents the game of chess and he brings it to the king, and the king thinks it's brilliant. He says, to reward you for inventing this game, I will give you anything that you desire. And the peasant looks to the king and he says, my desire is super simple. All that I require is a single grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, and exponential. And the king goes, oh my God, so cheap, right? Like all I got to do is pile some rice on this chessboard. But if you do the exponentials on that, it is more rice than the modern economy is going to produce over the next 70 years, right? Like it's a huge amount because you're doubling and it's 64 squares. So I tell people, when you think about exponential technology like
Mm-hmm.
AI, don't think about it as like we're on the first or second square. We're on the back half of the chessboard. So the contributions these technologies are going to make next year are so much greater, almost incomprehensibly greater than they are this year. And that applies not only to AI, but it applies to like biomedicine and genetics and all of these other technologies that have been in development for decades. And we're just now getting to the point where they're going to have this disruptive impact. So from a science fiction perspective, if harnessed correctly and with the right intentions, there's incredible things that can come from that. And we're going to cure diseases. We're going to, empower all this knowledge. I mean, we walk around with these crazy devices in our pocket that are supercomputers, that can tap into unique language models that can help us understand the world and draw upon the lessons and experiences of millions of other people, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people. So there's a lot to be excited about as well. So as is always the case with me, while you can take me down the dystopian cyberpunk route for a little bit, I always come out the other side with the opportunistic, like we can do better and do great things.
Well, I feel like that's a whole nother topic area. I could spend another 2 hours, but I'll say I've enjoyed getting to know Matt GPT. We chatted quite a bit on this journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a special shout out and thank you. He was definitely a great sounding board to bounce ideas off of to come up with these podcast
Excellent.
questions. So
it gets used. I mean, that's an experiment, but it gets used in the most unique ways that I love it. Like I pay the bill every month with no regrets because I just get these delightful messages.
Do you get to see all the data inputs?
I could, but I don't.
Oh,
so there's nothing stopping me. But I feel like to be true to the experience,
yeah,
they should be interacting. The one thing I do is like the system does flag if you ask a question and it responds back, I might have a hard time answering that.
mm-hmm.
I can go in and look at those questions and not see who asked them, but then respond, right? So I can help the system learn from things that it was not able to answer. And sometimes the correct answer is just like, yeah, you're right, you shouldn't be able to answer this. And other times it's like, well, let me share some, like I basically can articulate to it what I would have said, and it learns from that. So I do see some of the failed questions and I do action them, but I do not go and look at individual user behavior.
Well,
and as you notice, I make it available with no authentication and like no paywall or like it's just kind of free to use. And I have ambassadors that use it and executives that use it and students that use it. I mean, I get all this great kind of pleasant feedback around it.
Well, and I think true to yourself, it's the most thoughtful Gen AI tool that I've used. It always asks me back my perspective and my thoughts on it.
It's trying to instill that curiosity, right, by being conversational.
Yeah.
And trying to reframe it, back in the form of a question. So.
No, it's great. Well, I know we've covered a few topics, but where can our listeners learn more about Matt Devost and find you?
Yeah, I'm easy to find. I'm on Twitter just as Matt Devost. I'm on LinkedIn as just Devost. You can obviously visit OODA.com is our corporate website, or OODAloop.com. And then the Hack Factory is just hackfactory.com. So, I mean, it's easy to keep tabs. I actually am super transparent about what I'm doing and what I'm up to. So yeah, invite people to connect with me on whatever platform is most desirable for them.
Amazing.
I'm everywhere.
Well, thank you again. I so appreciate all your time, and this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, perfect.